Hello there and welcome. Tonight, allow me to gently guide you into the forgotten corridors of time, where empires rise, only to fade into the soft dust of memory, and where questions echo like lullabies through marble halls and broken columns. In this quiet corner of the world's past, we will uncover a mystery wrapped in centuries of silence and shadow. So please, find your most comfortable place, perhaps nestle into a cozy chair or lie back under a warm blanket. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let your breath slow as we begin a long and lingering journey into the heart of ancient Rome. Tonight we ask, what really caused the downfall of the Roman Empire? Was it the sword or something more silent? A slow unraveling, perhaps? 24 parts will lead us through this grand story, each one a candle in the dark. Let us begin. Long before Rome fell, it rose, like mist from the Tiber River, quiet and unseen. Its beginning was a whisper, a twin suckled by a wolf, a city born of myth and longing, cradled in destiny's hands. Romulus and Remus, you may know the tale. One brother would fall, the other would raise walls, and from that ancient blood came marble roads, iron laws, and dreams too vast for one world to hold. Rome, in its early days, was not yet the empire we picture. It was small, vulnerable, rough around the edges. It fought with neighbouring tribes, with itself, with the idea of power. But in its struggle, it grew stronger, hungrier. By the time the Republic bloomed, Rome had already tasted the sweetness of conquest and the bitterness of betrayal. Power shifted hands, not just through ballots but daggers. The Senate grew bold and rich, while the streets churned with hunger. Then came men with names carved into eternity, Scipio, Marius, Sulla, and the one whose shadow stretched farther than any, Julius Caesar. The Republic fell, not in a single day, but with many tiny, deliberate cuts. And in its place, an empire emerged, Augustus, the first emperor, ruling not as a king, but something more insidious, a god cloaked in the language of democracy. The empire surged outward like wildfire. It burned through Gaul, through Greece, through Egypt and beyond. Its roads connected mountains and deserts. Its laws brought order, or at least the illusion of it. Its armies stood like iron statues at the edges of the known world, and for a time there was peace, the Pax Romana they called it, a golden stillness after centuries of chaos. But even in peace, there are the seeds of decay. You see, the downfall of Rome didn't begin with fire or invasion. It began quietly, in moments so small they barely seemed worth noticing. A corrupted tax collector here, a weak general there, grain spoiling in North Africa, gold slipping out of the treasury, a senator bought with flattery, a merchant losing faith, a god no longer believed in. Rome's vastness, once its pride, became its burden. Communication grew strained. Rebellions took root in provinces too far from the capital to care. Soldiers, once loyal to the Senate, now pledged their hearts to ambitious warlords. And something else, something darker crept in. Fear. Fear of change. Fear of outsiders. Fear that the gods had abandoned them. Fear that the glory days had passed and might never return. All empires must confront a mirror at some point. Rome's reflection was beginning to crack. And yet, to the average Roman, life seemed normal. The bread still baked, the races still ran at the Circus Maximus, children played in fountains, lovers whispered under moonlight in marble courtyards. But beneath this calm, tremors. In the coming parts of our story, we will wander deeper into the lives of emperors, slaves, soldiers and seers. We'll feel the frost of the northern frontiers. We'll listen to whispers in the Senate halls. We'll walk the alleyways of Rome's poorest districts. And we'll trace each thread that unraveled this mighty empire, political, economic, spiritual, and personal. For tonight, let us pause on the edge of that golden age, the height of Roman greatness, and feel its stillness. Hold it in your hands, smell the incense, hear the lyres, taste the wine. It is important to know what was before we learn what was lost. Sleep gently now. The story continues soon. The moon hung low over the hills of Latium, casting a silver veil across the 7 hills of Rome. In the stillness of the night, the eternal city slept, her people tucked into stone homes, her gods silent in their marble shrines. But beneath that quiet exterior, the gears of empire never truly stopped turning. As we begin the second part of our journey, let us step gently into the age of emperors, those solitary figures draped in purple, standing between glory and ruin. For the fate of Rome was not carved in stone or dictated by battle alone. It rested in the hearts of men, many of whom bore the title Caesar, though few truly lived up to it. Tonight we drift into the palace halls of power, and we ask, how did the men who ruled the world begin to lose control of themselves? It began, as many things do, with success. The empire Augustus left behind was a well-oiled machine. He had learned from Caesar's fall and wrapped his power in the soft cloth of tradition. He respected the Senate, at least outwardly. He promised peace and delivered it. His rule was cautious, calculated, and when he died, the people wept. That was rare. But emperors who followed, some tried to imitate him, others tried to outshine him, and some simply tried to survive. Tiberius, his immediate successor, was brilliant but bitter. A general turned recluse. Tiberius fled from Rome's praise to the island of Capri, leaving the empire in the hands of his Praetorian Guard. He ruled through fear, through silence, whispers of treason, executions behind closed doors. The Senate bowed, not from respect, but from terror. Then came Caligula. Caligula. The name itself sounds like a mad dream. They called him Little Boots as a child, trailing after his father's legions. He was beloved when he rose to power, the bright young face of a new Rome. But something shifted within him. Something broke. Some say illness twisted his mind. Others say power revealed what was already there. He proclaimed himself a god. He ordered statues of himself in every temple. He laughed as senators grovelled. He dined with his horse. Whether truth or legend, the image stuck. An empire held hostage by the whims of a single man. His death was as violent as his reign, stabbed in a corridor, blood soaking the marble tiles. It would not be the last time. Claudius, timid and overlooked, surprised everyone by bringing stability again. He conquered Britannia. He reformed the legal system. But he was mocked for his stutter, his limp, his books. Poisoned, it said, by his wife Agrippina, who sought to place her son on the throne. And she did. Nero, whose name lingers like smoke in every story of Rome's fall. At first, he was guided by wise men, Seneca the philosopher, Burrus the general. Rome saw promise in the young emperor, but that promise rotted. He sang while the city burned, or so the story goes. Truth? He may not have started the fire, but he certainly used it, rebuilding the city in his image, erecting the golden palace atop the ashes. His paranoia grew. His mother murdered, his wife killed. His mentor Seneca forced to take his own life. The empire no longer felt guided, it felt possessed. And then, as always in Rome, the cycle turned. The people revolted, the legions refused to obey. Nero fled the city, hiding in a crumbling villa. And as pursuers approached, he asked one final question: what an artist dies in me? Then silence. With Nero's death, the empire slipped into a year of chaos. 4 emperors, 1 year. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. Each rising from the sword, each falling by it, except the last. Vespasian, a gruff general from the provinces, brought something Rome hadn't felt in years: normalcy. He built the Colosseum, the great amphitheatre of blood and bread. His sons followed him, Titus, who wept for Pompey, and Domitian, who ruled with ice in his veins. And so the Flavian dynasty held the line. Barely. But here in this carousel of emperors, the cracks began to spread. The army, once servants of the state, became kingmakers. Whoever paid them best, whoever promised the most, wore the crown. Rome's people mattered less. Its Senate mattered even less. The illusion of the Republic dimmed, and those chosen to rule, many were not ready. Some were scholars, others drunkards, some were kind, others cruel. But all bore the impossible weight of an empire straining under its own grandeur. In the provinces, whispers stirred. Gaul murmured of independence. Egypt grew restless. Judea rebelled, and in the east, a new threat watched, patient and proud: the Parthians. Later, the Sassanids. Rome's eastern frontier was no longer a border. It was a wound, yet within the city walls the fountains still flowed, the poets still recited, the statues still stood. But history doesn't always scream when change arrives. Sometimes it sighs. You see, Rome's fall was not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling, thread by thread. The emperor's throne was no longer sacred. It was a prize, a risk, a sentence. And Rome's people, though loyal, began to forget what their empire once meant. Tonight we watched emperors rise and fall. We walked the polished halls of palaces only to step over blood. We saw how greatness became routine, how power became theatre. Next we will drift into the provinces, the far edges of Rome's reach, and we will ask, What did the empire look like from the outside in? Sleep well and dream of marble. Far beyond the marble forums and echoing baths of Rome, where Latin was not the native tongue and the rhythms of empire beat more faintly, there lay the outer reaches of Roman might, the provinces. These were the wild edges of civilization, or so the Romans believed. But tonight, in the hush of candlelight and memory, we turn away from the imperial centre and drift outward. To understand Rome's fall, we must leave Rome. Imagine the long roads, straight and deliberate, stretching across forests and deserts, across the Rhine and into dusty Syria, into stormy Britannia, over the jagged heights of the Alps and into the plains of North Africa. Each mile was a stitch, sewing together a vast tapestry that covered the known world. But stitches can loosen. The provinces were where Rome's story was both told and tested. Conquered lands brought wealth, grain, olive oil, taxes, slaves. In exchange, Rome offered roads, laws, aqueducts, amphitheatres, and armies. It offered order, or the illusion of it. In Gaul, once fierce with tribal resistance, the local nobility began to dress like senators. In Hispania, Latin replaced ancient dialects. Temples to Jupiter rose beside old shrines to forgotten gods. In North Africa, Carthage, once razed, now flourished again under Roman rule, a strange echo of past rivalries turned into colonial pride. But not every province embraced Rome. Let us walk for a moment through Judea. To the Roman eye, this land was endlessly restless. Its people, fiercely monotheistic, devout, suspicious of outsiders, chafed under foreign rule. Taxes were high, tolerance low, governors were often brutal, and in the reign of Emperor Vespasian, Judea erupted. The Great Jewish Revolt, a flame that burned from 66 to 73 CE. In the desert fortress of Masada, nearly 1,000 rebels and their families chose death over surrender. Their story, passed down in silence and sorrow, marked not just resistance but deep resentment. Rome could conquer, yes, but could it truly bind the hearts of its subjects? In Britannia, resistance had a different face. A queen, Boudica, rose with fury. Her people, the Iceni, betrayed by the Romans, struck back with flame and sword. Cities were burned, legions were slaughtered. Rome retaliated, of course. The rebellion was crushed, but Britannia never fully trusted its masters again. Even in Gaul, where Roman culture had soaked deep into the soil, undercurrents of discontent remained. Loyalty in the provinces was often thin, held together not by love, but fear. And fear is brittle. The farther one travelled from Rome, the less Rome felt like home. Governors, often appointed more for loyalty than skill, acted as little emperors. Some bled their provinces dry to fund their own ambitions. Others neglected their duties, more interested in lavish villas than in justice. Corruption was not just common, it was expected. And the people noticed. More importantly, the soldiers noticed. You see, Roman legions were stationed across these vast lands, often cut off from the capital, from family, from the comforts of citizenship. Over time, they stopped seeing themselves as protectors of Rome. They became protectors of their commanders, their provinces, their own interests, and when a general promised them wealth or justice or revenge, they followed. This was the great weakness of empire: distance, not just of miles, but of meaning. In the east, the city of Palmyra rose like a pearl in the desert, growing rich from trade. It paid homage to Rome, but in its heart it beat to its own rhythm. Under the reign of Queen Zenobia in the 3rd century, Palmyra did the unthinkable. It declared independence. Zenobia, graceful and fierce, claimed descent from Cleopatra and ruled with unmatched ambition. She marched on Egypt. She challenged the authority of the emperor. For a moment, a sliver of the east slipped away. Rome fought back, of course. Emperor Aurelian, one of the last great warriors, defeated Zenobia and brought Palmyra back into the fold. But the lesson lingered. The provinces could dream of empire too. The unity of Rome was no longer a certainty. It was a balancing act, one made ever more fragile by the sheer size of what it tried to control. In the meantime, new faiths stirred among the stones. Christianity, born in the very province Rome struggled most to understand, began to spread, not by sword but by word, through markets, homes, whispered prayers in catacombs. In the provinces, it found soil more fertile than in the capital. It offered something Rome did not: hope for the lowly, the forgotten, the enslaved. Even among Roman citizens abroad, Christianity appealed, a God who walked among mortals, a promise of eternity. A kingdom not made by marble but by spirit. Rome, slow to notice, eventually responded with persecution. But fire could not stop the wind. The idea was already out, and it was growing. So here we are, wandering the shadowy roads of empire, from fiery Judea to distant Britannia, from restless Gaul to the golden sands of Palmyra. We see an empire expanding outward, yet hollowing inward, conquerors building monuments atop lands they did not understand, soldiers forgetting why they marched, subjects remembering a time before Rome. The provinces were Rome's mirror, reflecting not just its greatness, but its cracks. And as we move forward in our tale, the question deepens. Can an empire built by conquest survive without faith, without loyalty, without understanding? Next, we'll return to the heart of Rome, and there, in the rhythm of daily life, we'll begin to see how the very people of the city, once proud of their republic and their gods, began to lose something precious. And they didn't even realise it. Sleep now, with dreams of desert winds and distant drums. In the hush of the early Roman dawn, before the clatter of hooves echoed across cobbled streets and before merchants opened their stalls, the city held its breath. Rome, the heart of an empire, the navel of the world, sat still beneath a pale morning sky. But if you listened closely, past the silence, you could hear something else, a quiet erosion, not of buildings or borders, but of spirit. Let us now walk softly through the streets of the eternal city, not as conquerors or scholars, but as quiet observers. We're not here for the battles or the statues, we're here to feel what life was like as the soul of Rome began to dim. By the 3rd century, the marble that gleamed in Augustus's time had dulled. The streets were still busy, yes, vendors shouting prices, children playing among broken columns, senators riding in litters, but something had shifted beneath the surface. The Rome of Cicero and Cato, of Brutus and Caesar, was gone. The Republic had long since died, but in its place had grown not a single unified spirit, but fragments, conflicting, competing fragments, each with its own idea of what Rome should be. The people of Rome no longer believed in their rulers the way their ancestors once had. Emperors came and went too quickly. Some arrived from distant provinces with accents foreign to the Roman ear. Others were raised by armies, crowned with blood rather than tradition. To the average citizen, these men were distant, unreachable. The emperor was no longer a father of the nation. He was a ghost behind palace walls, or worse, a tyrant only seen when statues were unveiled. Trust began to fade. In the old republic, civic duty had been a pillar. Even the richest Roman citizens were expected to contribute, funding aqueducts, supporting games, sponsoring public works. It was an honour, not just a responsibility, but now that spirit had withered. Wealth remained. Of course, grand villas still dotted the Palatine Hill, banquets still overflowed with wine and song, but the motivation had shifted. Charity turned to vanity, duty turned to avoidance. The wealthy dodged taxes, buying influence instead. The poor, once empowered by grain doles and free entertainment, now found themselves lost in bureaucracy and neglect. The bread was thinner, the circuses crueler. The gap between rich and poor widened like a fault line under the city. And in that widening space, something darker took root: indifference. There was a time when Romans would gather in the forum, voices raised in heated debate, defending the Republic, the law, their ideals. Now those same spaces echoed with silence or else petty gossip. The Senate still met, but its power was ceremonial. The laws they passed carried little weight unless the emperor approved. The pulse of democracy had grown faint. Even religion, once a unifying force, had become a mosaic of confusion. The old gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, still had their temples, but their stories no longer stirred the heart. The rituals felt hollow, performed more from habit than faith. Mystery cults had begun to spread, imported gods from the East, secret ceremonies, strange rites. Christianity was growing in quiet corners, its followers huddled in underground chambers, speaking of one God, one truth. Rome, once unified in spirit, now felt like a city of strangers. And yet, on the surface, life went on. In the Subura district, life was noisy and raw. Tenement buildings stacked like fragile towers, people shouting from windows, water running through stone channels. The poor lived shoulder to shoulder, surviving on bread and salted fish, gossip and laughter. In the Campus Martius, children ran barefoot over the ancient training grounds of Rome's legions. They knew more about myth than war. Few would ever lift a sword for their empire. In the baths of Caracalla, the air was thick with steam and idle chatter. Senators bathed beside freedmen, philosophers argued beside generals. Yet even here there was a sense of something being forgotten, like a song whose melody fades before the final note. Civic pride no longer burned, it flickered. And what happens when a people lose faith in their city? When the very idea of Rome becomes abstract, a memory instead of a mission. The signs were everywhere. Maintenance of roads within the city slowed. Fountains, once full of clear water, now trickled or dried. Statues eroded from neglect. The vibrant wall paintings faded beneath layers of soot and time. The city that had once been the wonder of the world was still beautiful, but like an old man wearing a young man's clothes, the illusion was slipping. Some citizens sensed it, a subtle unease, a longing for something lost. They would speak in hushed tones about the old days, about great men and great victories. But the young only half listened. The world they knew was different, more uncertain, more fragile. Rome still claimed dominion over the world, but it was beginning to lose dominion over itself. And yet life pulsed on. Weddings were celebrated, children were born, lovers walked beside the Tiber, laughter still echoed from taverns. The city lived, even as something vital within it quietly ebbed away. This, then, is how cities fall, not always in flames, but in forgetting. As we close this chapter, the heart of Rome continues to beat, though faintly. A beautiful illusion sustained by momentum, memory and marble, but we now see it, the erosion from within, the quiet fading of unity and purpose. Soon pressures from outside will test this fragile core. But before the invasions or the sieges, before the collapse, we must first understand the shadows cast within the palace itself. For in our next part, we will walk the corridors of the imperial court once more and witness how ambition, betrayal and paranoia would fracture the spine of the empire from the top down. Let your thoughts drift gently now, like incense rising in a quiet temple. The story continues soon. In the flickering torchlight of Rome's imperial palaces, where shadows danced across frescoed walls and silence lingered behind every column, power had become a dangerous game. No longer tempered by principle or duty, it had grown feral, feeding on fear, ambition and betrayal. And so as the empire strained outward, its core trembled beneath the weight of its own rulers. Tonight, we step carefully through the marbled halls of the palace, not as guests, but as invisible witnesses. We follow the footsteps of emperors, chamberlains, spies and assassins, and we observe not battles in fields, but the quieter, colder battles fought in whispers. For the fall of Rome was as much a story of its rulers as it was of its enemies. By the 3rd century, the imperial throne was no longer a seat. It was a target. The crisis of the 3rd century, they would later call it. In the span of just 50 years, from 235 to 284 CE, Rome saw no fewer than 26 emperors rise and fall. Some ruled for months, a few for days. Most met violent ends. This was not governance. This was chaos masquerading as order. It began with the murder of Emperor Severus Alexander, a young and timid ruler who sought peace when the army craved war. His soldiers, disillusioned and impatient, turned on him and his mother, slaughtering them both. With their deaths, the old illusion that emperors were divinely protected shattered. What followed was an empire ruled by the sword. General after general declared himself emperor. Loyalty meant little. Armies no longer served Rome, they served their commanders. Whoever paid them, fed them, promised them glory. And so the empire splintered not just in geography, but in loyalty. At times there were multiple emperors at once, each claiming to be the true Caesar, one in Rome, another in Gaul, a third in the east. Civil war became routine. Provinces shifted allegiance like wind-blown leaves. The Senate, powerless. The people, exhausted. And amid this maelstrom of ambition, a new player rose, the Praetorian Guard. Originally formed to protect the emperor, the Praetorians now played kingmaker. They sold the throne to the highest bidder, literally. In one infamous moment after the assassination of Emperor Pertinax, the Guard auctioned the empire to the wealthy senator Didius Julianus. His reign lasted just over 2 months. Trust in Rome's institutions crumbled. Meanwhile, outside the walls, real threats gathered. The Goths and the Franks tested the northern borders. In the east, the Sassanid Persians emerged with fire in their eyes and steel in their hands. Cities were razed, armies humiliated, entire legions lost. And within, plague returned. The plague of Cyprian, they called it. Bodies piled in streets, citizens fled, superstition soared. Some believed it was divine punishment, others turned to new gods for answers. In this chaos, emperors tried to hold the centre. Some were fools, some were cowards. But a few shone briefly like torches in the dark. One such man was Aurelian. A general from humble Aurelian rose not by flattery but by force. He fought like a lion, marched like a machine, and in a few short years he did the unthinkable. He restored the fractured empire. He defeated the breakaway Gallic Empire in the west. He crushed Queen Zenobia's Palmyrene Empire in the east. He reinforced the city's walls, aware now that Rome itself was vulnerable. They called him Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. But even Aurelian, sharp and feared as he was, could not escape the paranoia that poisoned the imperial court. His own officers, fearing his growing power, plotted his death. A forged document, falsely suggesting he planned to purge them, sealed his fate. They murdered him on the road before he could defend himself. And so the pattern continued. Paranoia, betrayal, blood. Each new emperor inherited not just a crown but a curse. Even administrative efforts faltered. Rome's bureaucracy, once admired, grew bloated. Taxes rose sharply, currency was debased. Silver coins alloyed with cheaper metals. Inflation soared. The economy, once powered by plunder and trade, limped on shaky legs. People hoarded. Markets destabilized. Confidence waned. Amid this turmoil, one might wonder, why didn't the empire simply fall then? But Rome did not fall like a tower. It crumbled like a cliffside, slowly with each tide. And so it endured, wounded but upright, desperate for stability, desperate for someone strong enough to hold the chaos at bay. That someone would come soon. A man of cold vision and iron will. But before we meet him, let us pause and consider what the imperial court had become. Not a place of statecraft, but of survival, where friends were suspect and family even more so, where emperors ruled in fear and died by the same. Power had become a poison, and the throne a coffin in disguise. This too was Rome's unraveling. Not through foreign invasion, but from the inner rot of ambition unbound. In our next chapter, we will meet the man who would attempt to reshape the empire, to divide it, to reform it, and in doing so, alter its fate forever. But for now, let your mind settle into the silence of the palace corridors, where footsteps echo and secrets sleep behind stone doors. The story continues soon. As twilight bled into dusk over the jagged peaks of the Balkans and the Tiber River shimmered beneath a pale and weary moon, a new figure emerged from the shadows of Rome's fractured throne. Not with fanfare, not with poetry, but with purpose. A man carved from granite, moulded by war and guided not by hope, but by necessity. His name was Diocletian, and he would not only rule the empire, he would divide it. In this part of our tale, we drift into an era of reform, of iron decisions, of attempts, perhaps desperate, to save what remained. Diocletian did not seek the crown for glory. He found it lying broken in the mud and lifted it because no one else could. When Diocletian became emperor in 284 CE, Rome was unrecognizable from the glory days of Augustus. The frontiers were bleeding. Armies chose emperors like dice in a cup. Coins were nearly worthless. Famine, plague, civil war. This was not an empire. It was a storm. But Diocletian was not a man of sentiment. He did not long for the past. He looked at the chaos with a soldier's eyes and saw only one path: control. His first move was radical. He did what no emperor had dared before. He shared power, not as a gesture, not as a formality, but as strategy. Diocletian appointed a trusted general, Maximian, as co-emperor. Together, they would rule east and west. Rome too large, too unruly for one man to grasp alone, but even two were not enough. And so came the Tetrarchy, 4 rulers, 2 senior emperor Augusti, 2 junior emperors Caesares, a square of power designed to rotate with time to ensure smooth succession and stability. On paper, it was brilliance. For a moment, the storm calmed, borders rebels were coursed, and new walls were crushed. A new administrative system was laid like fresh stonework atop old Roman roads. Provinces were subdivided, local governors held tighter reins. Diocletian reformed the military, splitting forces into frontier legions and mobile units that could respond swiftly to threats. He fortified the Danube in the east. He redrew the map, not in conquest but in organisation. But reforms came at a cost. To fund his ambitious vision, Diocletian needed revenue, lots of it. He issued new taxes, heavy ones, based on land and production. Census after census scoured the countryside, counting fields, livestock, labourers. The result, a more predictable economy. But also, more burden on the backs of the poor. People could not flee their taxes, so he bound them to their land. A farmer could no longer leave his plot. A son could not change his father's profession. It was the beginning of a quiet shift, from citizen to subject, from free movement to fixed destiny. Rome had once prided itself on liberty, but Diocletian's Rome prized survival. Even the gods were summoned to serve order. Diocletian, unlike many emperors before him, was devout. Not to the old pantheon of poetic myths, but to one figure, Jupiter, supreme among the Roman gods. He fashioned his own image after the divine. He called himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Gone was the illusion of the emperor as first among equals. Diocletian wanted no such mask. He was emperor by divine right, distant, unapproachable, worshipped. He wore robes of gold. His audience chamber glimmered with ritual. Those who entered bowed, not as citizens, but as subjects. This shift was not just ceremonial, it was cultural. The empire was no longer Rome in its old sense. It was becoming something else. Less republican, more autocratic. Less city-state, more imperial machine. And in this atmosphere of control, Diocletian made a decision that would echo for centuries. He struck at Christianity. It had grown, slowly but surely, even through persecution. No longer a fringe sect, it had followers across the empire, among slaves, merchants, soldiers, and nobles alike. To Diocletian, Christianity was a threat, not just spiritually, but structurally. Christians refused to worship the emperor, refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods. In a state built on unity and tradition, this was seen as subversion, and so came the Great Persecution. Churches were burned, scriptures destroyed, bishops imprisoned, many died, many more fled, and yet, like fire spreading through dry fields, Christianity endured. Every martyr fed the flame. Every execution added another story whispered in darkened rooms. Diocletian believed he was preserving the empire, but in trying to erase a new faith, he immortalized it. Eventually, weary of power, Diocletian did something no emperor had ever done. He retired. He walked away. He built a palace on the Adriatic coast, what would one day become the city of Split. There, surrounded by gardens and sea breeze, he grew cabbages and listened to the wind. A soldier turned emperor turned gardener. When later begged to return to the throne as crisis brewed again, he famously replied, "If you could see the vegetables I grow, you wouldn't ask me to take up the cares of empire again." But the system he built, the tetrarchy, did not hold. Power, once split, yearned to be whole again. The successors clashed, civil war returned, ambition, like a fire beneath the ash, reignited. And from that fire, a new figure would rise. One who would change Rome's future and the world's. But that story too must wait. Tonight we watched a man try to remake an empire, through structure, through severity, through sheer will. We saw a turning point, not a fall, but a transformation. Rome was no longer the city of Cicero, no longer the dream of Augustus. It had become something heavier, stranger, and perhaps more fragile than ever. Now rest, traveller of memory. Let your thoughts drift across maps drawn in ink and ambition. The tale continues soon. In the soft hush that follows the footsteps of emperors, history shifts, sometimes silently. And so, after Diocletian's retreat into his coastal palace, the empire stood at a precipice once more, divided not just in geography but in ambition. The careful lattice of the tetrarchy began to tremble under the weight of human nature. It was not long before unity was desired again, not for the sake of harmony, but for power. And into this fragile moment, riding with the shadow of a legend and the gleam of destiny, came a man named Constantine. He was not born in marble halls. He was born on the move, amid camps, marching boots and the scent of iron. His father was Constantius Chlorus, one of Diocletian's appointed Caesars. His mother Helena was of humble origin. Their union produced more than a son. It produced a legend in waiting. Constantine's rise was not ordained. It was contested. After Diocletian's retirement, the carefully designed balance collapsed into conflict. Rival emperors clashed, alliances broke, legions chose sides, and young Constantine, ever the tactician, watched and waited. Then one night in 312 CE, as he prepared to face his most dangerous rival, Maxentius, outside the walls of Rome, something happened, something mysterious, something he would never forget. He claimed to see a sign in the sky, a cross of light, and with it a message, in hoc signo vinces. In this sign, you will conquer. That night, he ordered his soldiers to paint a strange symbol on their shields, 2 Greek letters interwoven, chi and rho, the first letters of Christos, the symbol of Christianity. The next day, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine triumphed. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, his body swept away by the very river that cradled Rome's birth. Constantine entered the city not just as a victor, but as something more, a chosen one. And from that day forward, Rome's destiny took a new path. He was not yet the sole emperor. That would take time, battles, and patience. But by 3G24 CE, he had conquered the East, defeated his final rival, and stood alone, one man, one empire. But this was not the Rome of the past. Constantine, like Diocletian before him, saw that the old city, clogged, decayed, fragile, could no longer serve as the beating heart of an empire that stretched from misty Britannia to sunburned Egypt. So he founded a new capital, a city of his own, Constantinople. On the edge of Europe and Asia, where trade flowed and armies marched, Constantine laid the foundations of a new Rome. Cleaner, safer, Christian. He poured wealth into it. Palaces, churches, forums. He modelled it on the old capital, but without its decay. He filled it with senators, scholars, scribes, and priests. It would endure long after the Western Empire fell, a flame that burned for 1,000 more years. But it wasn't just stone that Constantine reshaped. He changed the very soul of Rome. For centuries, Christians had been persecuted, scattered, hunted, martyred. Now they were welcomed, elevated, given back their churches and texts, given protection. And in 313 CE, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, a decree of tolerance. Christians were now free to worship. The old gods, still worshipped by many, remained. But something had shifted. The empire was no longer merely Roman. It was becoming Christian. It was not an immediate transformation. Constantine himself was baptized only on his deathbed. He still used pagan imagery on coins. He still respected the old festivals. But his patronage, his favour was clear. And in time, the church would become one of the empire's most powerful pillars. This was a turning point. The empire no longer knelt before Jupiter, Mars, or Apollo. It now turned its gaze to one god, unseen, eternal, unyielding. The temples of marble gods fell into shadow, and basilicas rose, echoing with chants, incense, and prayer. Constantine also reformed administration. He separated civil and military powers. He strengthened the coinage. He elevated new men, often Christians, to positions of influence. But his reforms, like those before him, could not reverse all that time had eroded. The economy remained fragile, the borders ever pressured, and the deep wounds of division still festered. Though Constantine had united the empire under one crown, he did not ensure its lasting unity. Upon his death in 337 CE, his sons divided the realm again, like spoils of war. The East, the West, the seeds of future schisms already planted. But let us pause here. In this chapter, we have watched a man seize chaos and bend it toward vision. Constantine, commander, reformer, founder, believer. He was not flawless. He killed rivals. He maneuvered ruthlessly, yet his choices shaped centuries. The Rome that emerged from his rule was no longer a city of republics and temples. It was a land of bishops, relics, and saints. Power no longer flowed solely through the Senate or the sword, but through the cross. And while the western half of the empire would soon stagger toward collapse, the eastern half, his half, would carry the flame. But every flame needs fuel. And in the next chapter of our journey, we will feel the slow choking of that flame in the west. As new pressures rise, old loyalties crumble, and distant horsemen begin to ride toward the heart of empire. For now, rest. Let the winds of the Bosporus cradle your thoughts, and the flicker of lamplight guide your dreams. The story continues soon. The sun was setting over the hills of Italia, casting long shadows across the emptying roads, once trodden by legions in perfect formation. These were roads that had led Rome to glory, but now they bore different feet, restless ones, weary ones, foreign ones. As Constantine's vision of a renewed empire took root in the east, the west began to lose its shape, like a statue slowly worn down by wind and rain. And so begins the 8th part of our story, a quiet, aching descent into fragmentation. After Constantine's death, the empire he had united did not remain so for long. His sons, inheriting not only their father's crowns but also his rivalries, divided the realm into separate dominions. Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius II Brothers by blood but not by peace clashed for supremacy. Civil war erupted once more. In the span of 2 decades, all but one brother had fallen. Constantius Tick emerged alone, ruling a battered but intact empire. Yet the scars of fraternal conflict ran deep. Provinces grew disillusioned. Generals, once content with command, now hungered for crowns. The throne became a revolving door. Usurpers rose from Gaul, from Africa, from the Balkans. Some lasted mere weeks. Others carved out dominions. The court in Constantinople tried to maintain order, but its gaze often turned eastward, where threats loomed larger and revenues flowed steadier. The West, once the jewel of the empire, was growing dim. Rome itself, though still proud in name, no longer served as the seat of imperial power. Milan, then Ravenna, had become the new centres, closer to the frontiers, easier to defend. Rome, the eternal city, now echoed more with memories than with might. And at those frontiers, the storm clouds gathered. In the forests and steppes beyond the Rhine and Danube, tribes stirred: Goths, Vandals, Alans, Franks. To Romans, these were barbarians. To themselves, they were nations. They had always been there, of course. Rome had fought them, traded with them, hired them into its armies. But now, something was changing. These tribes were not merely raiding. They were moving, driven by hunger, by pressure, and by fear. For from far to the east, beyond even the wildest Roman imagination, a new terror galloped forth. The Huns, nomads from the steppes of Central Asia, riding swift horses and wielding deadly bows. The Huns descended upon Europe like a thunderstorm. They devastated the Gothic tribes who had lived along the Danube, burning villages, scattering warriors, tearing apart the fragile order beyond the Roman limes. And the Goths, desperate and broken, fled. In 376 CE, a vast group of Gothic refugees, men, women, children, stood at the banks of the Danube begging for entry into the empire. They sought shelter, not conquest, safety, not war. The emperor at the time, Valens, ruled the east. He saw in this request both opportunity and risk. He allowed them in, perhaps hoping to settle them as farmers, to use them as a buffer against future threats. But Rome was no longer good at mercy. The officials charged with managing the Gothic migration were corrupt. They extorted the refugees, denied them food, enslaved some, abused others. The Goths, humiliated and starving, turned against their hosts. In 378 CE, the empire faced the consequences. At the Battle of Adrianople, the Goths, once supplicants, became executioners. They crushed the Roman army in the fields of Thrace. Emperor Valens was killed, his body never found. 2/3 of his army lay dead. It was a catastrophe, one Rome had not seen since the days of Hannibal. More than a defeat, it was a revelation. The legions were no longer invincible. The barbarians were no longer at the gates. They were inside them. In the years that followed, Gothic tribes roamed the empire. Some plundered, others settled. Many were hired as soldiers, mercenaries paid in coin and promises. But Rome could no longer afford pride. It needed warriors, even if those warriors once burned Roman villas. Meanwhile, in the West, emperors came and went, some children, some puppets. Real power lay increasingly in the hands of generals. Men like Stilicho, a half-Vandal who commanded Rome's armies and held the empire together by sheer will. But even he could not stop the tide. The Western Empire, unlike the East, had fewer cities, less wealth and more vulnerable borders. Its farms were ravaged, its people overtaxed, its soldiers underpaid, its spirit frayed. By the early 5th century, one name would send chills through the marble halls of what remained of Roman nobility. Alaric, a Gothic chieftain, once an ally, now an enemy. He marched south, not just to raid, but to make a statement. And in 410 CE, something happened that had not occurred in 800 years. Rome was sacked. The eternal city, once unassailable, was breached by foreign hands. Not completely destroyed, no. Not burned to the ground, but plundered, violated, exposed. The shock echoed across the empire, across the world. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, declared, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." The unthinkable had become reality. Rome, the mother of all cities, wept. And though the empire still stood, its provinces, its courts, its armies, it now stood as a shadow of what it once was. No longer feared, no longer eternal, just fragile and tired. In this part of our journey, we've seen the curtain begin to fall. Not all at once, but in tremors. Civil war, migration, corruption, and the shattering of illusions. But deeper still lies a question. Could Rome have adapted? Could it have embraced the changes, welcomed the outsiders, reformed itself from within? Or was it always fated to break under the weight of its own greatness? In our next chapter, we will watch the empire fracture further and witness how the rise of faith would battle the fall of empire, as bishops and emperors wrestled for the soul of a world unraveling. For now, rest. Let the fires of Rome's ancient hearth fade to embers in your thoughts. The story continues soon. In the wake of smoke that still lingered over Rome's battered rooftops, something began to stir, not with swords or siege engines, but with song, not with laws etched in bronze, but with prayers spoken in quiet halls. As the Western Empire stumbled, a new power rose, not born of the forum, but from the altar. This is the 9th part of our journey, and tonight we step into the sacred spaces of the late empire, where incense curled into the rafters and choirs sang under crumbling domes. Here, amid the falling marble, rose the voice of faith. Christianity, once a hidden current beneath the empire's surface, was now the tide itself. The sack of Rome in 410 CE had shaken the world, but not everyone saw it as the end. Some saw it as a beginning. One man, living far from the ruins, picked up his pen. His name was Augustine. Bishop of Hippo, a city on the North African coast, Augustine had once wandered through philosophies, through pleasures, through doubt. But now, as the world he knew seemed to collapse, he wrote something vast, something eternal. The City of God. It was not a defense of Rome's greatness, but a reimagining of what greatness truly was. Augustine declared that there were two cities, the city of man and the city of God. The first, Rome in all its grandeur, was built by pride, destined to fall. The second, unseen, spiritual, eternal, was built by love and would never perish. This idea would take root deeply in the soil of a dying empire. For many Roman citizens, faith had become more than personal. It had become communal, redemptive, unshakable. As emperors failed, bishops remained. As palaces crumbled, churches rose. And in every town, in every troubled province, the church began to take on roles the state no longer could. It fed the hungry, cared for the sick, negotiated with raiders, protected refugees. It gave hope where Rome gave taxes, gave mercy where emperors gave silence. In the West, where order fell away like old plaster, the church stepped forward, not as a rival to Rome, but as its inheritor. The bishops of Gaul, of Spain, of North Africa became pillars in a crumbling society. And in Rome itself, the bishop, once a local cleric, now called the Pope, began to wield a new kind of influence. One such Pope, Leo the Great, would face not just theological disputes but enemies at the gates. In 452 CE, Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, marched toward Rome. His path was fire and ruin. Cities had fallen, armies scattered, and the eternal city, already wounded, prepared to fall again. But something remarkable happened. Leo rode out to meet him, not with legions, but with faith. The two spoke, alone, or so the tale goes. And when they emerged, Attila turned away. Rome was spared. Why did he retreat? Some say it was fear of disease, of famine, of a surprise attack. Others whisper of bribes, of omens. But the image that endured was this. A pope, not a general, had saved the city. Power was shifting. The church had become the soul of the West. And yet, this rising influence came at a time of painful division. The Roman world was no longer whole, not just politically, but spiritually. Old tensions brewed between the churches of Rome and Constantinople. Differences in language, in liturgy, in theology. The Bishop of Rome claimed primacy. The East saw him as first among equals, not supreme. These rifts had not yet broken into schism. But the fault lines were there, beneath the hymns and incense, beneath the councils and creeds. Even within the faith, unity was hard to hold. The empire, now Christian in name, struggled with heresies. Arianism, which denied the full divinity of Christ, had spread among many of the Gothic tribes. These same tribes, now serving in Roman armies or settling in Roman lands, worshipped a different Christ than the empire's official creed. Unity was a dream fading behind stained glass. Still, the church endured and grew. Monasteries sprang up in the countryside, quiet places of prayer and learning, of farming and copying ancient texts. In an age of violence, they became sanctuaries of memory. Here, monks lit candles over scrolls, Virgil, Cicero, Aristotle. They preserved not just scripture, but civilization. And so as the Western Empire declined, a new continuity was born. Rome was no longer just an empire, it was an idea. And the church carried that idea forward, not on banners, but on parchment and faith. But not all was peace. Not all was light. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire did not come like a hammer blow, but like an illness, slow, uneven, deadly. The imperial court in Ravenna grew ever weaker. One by one, provinces slipped away. Britannia abandoned, Gaul fractured, Spain invaded, North Africa lost to the Vandals. The economy failed, the military thinned. The Senate, once the voice of the Republic, now merely a whisper in the wind. And yet, in the midst of this fading grandeur, the church kept singing, in Latin, in Greek, in chants that echoed through ruined cities and fog-covered valleys. It remembered what Rome had been, and imagined what it might become again. In our next chapter, we will walk through the final moments of the Western Empire, a boy emperor, a barbarian king, and the end of something that once claimed to be eternal. But tonight, let your thoughts settle in the silence of an old chapel, where stone meets shadow and memory is a kind of prayer. The story continues soon. Beneath the ever-dimming light of Rome's western sky, a silence began to grow, not sudden, not empty, but heavy, like a curtain slowly falling over a once great stage. This was not the silence of peace. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of centuries spent expanding, reforming, resisting, and now of surrender. Tonight we find ourselves at the edge of an ending. This is the 10th part of our story, the final days of the Western Roman Empire. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Empire had become a pale reflection of its former self. Its territory had shrunk like cloth in the rain. Gone were the days of conquest. Now, every day was a defence. Every year, a loss. In 455 CE, disaster returned once more to Rome's doorstep. The Vandals, led by their king Genseric, sailed from North Africa and reached the Tiber. Unlike Alaric's Visigoths decades earlier, these raiders had come by sea. They found a city unprepared, weakened, resigned, and for 2 long weeks they plundered it. The Vatican was stripped, homes were ransacked, treasures carried off. But again, the city was not burned. Rome endured, but barely. It had become a symbol more than a city, a name more than a power. And as it limped through the next decades, its rulers became increasingly irrelevant. Puppet emperors placed on crumbling thrones by generals, by warlords, by foreign kings. Some ruled for months, a few for days. Few were remembered. Fewer were mourned. The true power now lay in the hands of generals, men like Ricimer, a Germanic warlord who never took the crown but controlled those who wore it. He deposed emperors, installed others, always from the shadows. Rome's fate was no longer decided in senatorial chambers, but in military camps and whispered bargains. Meanwhile, the East, centred in Constantinople, watched with a mixture of pity and detachment. The emperors there still ruled in golden halls, still issued edicts, still dreamed of unity, but the West was slipping beyond reach. By 476 CE, the end was inevitable. The last emperor of the West was a boy, Romulus Augustulus, a name caught between 2 titans, Romulus, founder of the city, Augustus, founder of the empire. But this Romulus was no founder, he was barely a ruler, a young figurehead placed on the throne by his father Orestes, a Roman general of some influence. But the army, composed largely of Germanic mercenaries, demanded land, reward, recognition. Orestes refused, and from among those mercenaries rose a man named Odoacer. He led a rebellion, swift and final. Orestes was captured and executed. The boy emperor Romulus was spared, sent into retirement, his life exchanged for silence. Odoacer did not claim the title of emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and declared himself King of Italy. He ruled in practice what the empire had once claimed in name. And so the Western Roman Empire came to an end, not with a final battle, not with a collapse of walls or a last heroic defense, but with a surrender. Quiet, bureaucratic, almost polite. There were no fireworks, no monuments erected, no final lament from the Senate. The world simply moved on. Yet not everyone understood the weight of the moment. To many, life continued much the same. Farmers still worked their fields. Merchants still opened their stalls. Soldiers still marched, now under different banners. Rome had not vanished, it had changed costume. But for those who remembered the glory of Caesar, of Trajan, of Marcus Aurelius, it was a death too large for words. The eternal city, though still standing, was now a memory, and in that memory lived both sorrow and myth. But endings too hold seeds. The church remained, its bishops grew stronger, its rituals more central. It became the thread that tied together a fractured world. Roman law, Roman roads, Roman language, all faded slowly but not completely. They would echo in monasteries, in medieval courts, in the thoughts of future emperors who would dream of restoration. The name Rome would not die. It would pass into legend, into longing. It would be reborn in new forms, Holy Roman, Byzantine, Renaissance. But the empire that began with Augustus, that conquered Carthage, that stood against Hannibal, that built the Colosseum and aqueducts and wrote the laws of nations, that empire had ended, and the world was no longer Roman. It was something new, something uncertain. As we close this chapter, let us linger for a moment with the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus. Not in power, but in exile. A teenager watching the sun set on a dream too old for his hands to hold. Some say he lived a quiet life, others that he faded into obscurity. But in that boy, in his quiet exit, lives the last breath of an empire that once held the world. In our next chapter, we will travel beyond the fall to see what rose from the ashes, how the East endured, how memory became power, how Rome, though dead in body, would rise in name again. But for now, sleep. Let the wind carry you over the ruins of the Forum, where once senators argued, and now only the night listens. The story continues soon. With the Western Empire gone, the world did not end. It shifted. In place of the old, something unfamiliar began to form. A world without emperors in the West, without legions on the Rhine, without a senate, echoing with oratory. But across the sea, beyond the Adriatic and into the East, the Roman Empire did not fall. It adapted. It endured. In this 11th part of our story, we journey to Constantinople, a city of light on the edge of two worlds. It had been founded by Constantine as a second Rome, but it was more than that now. It was the only Rome. Its walls rose high above the Bosporus, golden domes glinting in the sunlight, guarded by sea on three sides and by engineering on the fourth. Here, emperors still reigned, not over a crumbling realm, but over a different kind of empire. Wealthier, more urban, more Greek in tongue, more Christian in spirit. This was the Eastern Roman Empire. And in time, people would call it something else. Byzantium. The term would be applied later by scholars, but the people who lived there never called themselves anything but Romaioi, Romans. To them, Rome had not fallen, it had simply moved east. And yet survival did not mean stasis. This new Rome bore little resemblance to the city of Caesar or Cicero. Its culture shimmered with the colours of the East. Silks from China, spices from Arabia, manuscripts from Alexandria. The markets of Constantinople bustled with goods and voices from every corner of the known world. The emperor's court was no longer a place of rustic togas and stern simplicity. It was ceremonial, glittering, bound in ancient rites and imperial theology. Purple robes, golden crowns, jewelled icons. The emperor was not just a ruler, he was God's regent on earth. And few emperors embodied this vision more completely than Justinian. Ruling from 5527 to 5565 CE, Justinian was born in humble circumstances, a peasant by birth, but rose through education, ambition and favour. When he took the throne, he did not merely want to reign, he wanted to restore. His dream was clear, to reunite the empire, to reclaim the West. He appointed Belisarius, a general of rare brilliance and loyalty, and unleashed him upon the crumbling remains of what had once been Rome's dominion. In Africa, they struck first, defeating the Vandals and reclaiming Carthage. Then Italy. Belisarius marched into a fractured peninsula, battling the Ostrogoths, capturing Rome and pressing north. The war was brutal. Cities were sieged, populations starved, treasures lost. It was not the triumphant restoration Justinian envisioned. It was a slow reconquest. But in time, much of Italy fell back under imperial control. Even parts of Spain followed. For a brief moment, the dream flickered, a Rome made whole. But holding these lands proved harder than reclaiming them. The West was broken, its cities exhausted, its roads overgrown. The wars drained the treasury, cost thousands of lives, and left the eastern provinces vulnerable. Justinian's legacy, however, was not only in war. He ordered the construction of the Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, a church unlike any the world had seen. Its vast dome floated on hidden arches, its marble walls shimmered with gold mosaics. It was an earthly echo of heaven, a monument to Christian Rome and imperial glory. He also codified Roman law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, gathered centuries of legal tradition into a single coherent form. It would shape not just Byzantium, but the laws of Europe for generations to come. Justinian ruled with his wife Theodora, a woman as formidable as any emperor. Born an actress, a profession often scorned, she rose to become empress and wielded power with steely resolve. During the Nika riots, a massive revolt that nearly toppled the throne, it was Theodora who refused to flee. "Royal purple," she said, "makes a fine burial shroud." The rebellion was crushed, the empire held, and yet for all their glory, Justinian's reign left cracks. Plague ravaged the empire, the Justinianic plague, perhaps the first wave of what would later be known as the Black Death. It swept through cities, silencing thousands. Constantinople, once teeming, fell into stillness. The war-weary provinces grew resentful. The reconquered West proved difficult to govern, and when Justinian died, his dream of a unified empire faded with him. But Byzantium endured. It would continue for centuries, sometimes strong, sometimes desperate. It would fend off Persians, Arabs, Bulgars. It would build monasteries on windswept cliffs and send missionaries to the Slavs. It would preserve ancient texts like pass them to the world, and through it all, it called itself Roman. But this was no longer the empire of legionaries and pagan rites. It was Christian, Eastern, introspective. It spoke Greek, not Latin. It looked to Constantinople, not Rome. Even so, its memory of Rome, the old Rome, remained a guiding star, a thing to be longed for, even as time carried it farther into shadow. As the West descended into feudal kingdoms, Byzantium kept the flame. But a new force was rising in the West, not emperors, not legions, but kings. And one of them would seek not just to rule, but to resurrect the imperial idea in his own image. From the forests of Germania, he would ride with a crown not of laurel but of iron. And once more the name of Rome would be invoked, not by Romans, but by those who dreamed in its echo. As the embers of the Western Empire cooled into memory and Constantinople stood as its luminous successor, something unexpected stirred in the north. Among the forests and rivers of what the old Romans once called Barbaricum, land beyond the empire's borders, a new ambition began to rise. It came not from marble palaces or coastal villas, but from wooden halls and misty vales, where Germanic chieftains carved their names into blood-soaked land and forged kingdoms from war and oath. Here, in the realm of the Franks, a leader would emerge. A man with iron in his grip and Rome in his mind. His name was Charlemagne. In this 12th part of our story, we turn into the dawn of the medieval world and to a rebirth, a revival, not of the Roman Empire as it was, but of what it meant. Charles, later called the Great, was born in 742 CE, a prince of the Carolingian dynasty. His family had already begun to eclipse the old Merovingian kings, who had ruled the Franks in name, but held little real power. Charles's father, Pepin the Short, had seized the throne with the Pope's blessing, a transaction that quietly revealed a shift. The crown no longer came only through blood, but through the church. When Charlemagne inherited the throne in 768, he did not simply rule, he expanded. He waged campaigns nearly every year of his reign against the Lombards in Italy, the Saxons in the north, the Avars in the east, and the Moors in Spain. His armies moved like tides, carving an empire that spanned most of Western and Central Europe. The map had not looked so unified since the days of Theodosius, centuries before, but conquest was only part of Charlemagne's vision. He believed in order, in learning, in faith. He reformed the Frankish legal system, standardized coinage, and encouraged literacy among the clergy and nobility. He invited scholars from across Europe to his court at Aachen, Alcuin of York among the most famous, and commissioned the copying of classical texts. This was the Carolingian Renaissance. In dim monasteries and candlelit scriptoria, scribes wrote not only scripture but Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil. Much of what we know today of Rome's literary and philosophical legacy survives because of this quiet revival. But Charlemagne's greatest moment came not on the battlefield, but in a church. It was Christmas Day in the year 800, in Rome. Charlemagne had come to the city, partly as a pilgrim, partly as protector of the Pope, who had faced revolt and accusation. During Mass at St. Peter's Basilica, as incense filled the air and hymns rose into the vaulted dome, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon Charles's head, and with it a title, Emperor of the Romans. The crowd cheered. The moment was monumental. For the first time since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the title had been reborn, not in Italy, not in Constantinople, but in the heart of Frankish Europe. What did it mean? To Charlemagne, it meant legitimacy, authority not just over his own lands, but over Christendom itself. It bound his rule to the legacy of Rome. To the Pope, it meant protection and power. He had crowned the emperor, not the other way around. The church, it seemed, now held the keys to imperial authority. But to the emperor in Constantinople, it was an insult, a challenge, a usurpation. For the Eastern Roman Empire had never accepted the West's collapse as final. They saw themselves as the true heirs of Augustus. To them, this new emperor in the West was a barbarian in borrowed robes. Diplomacy followed, tensions cooled. Eventually, the Byzantines would grudgingly acknowledge Charlemagne's title, but with limits. This moment, the coronation, was more than symbolic. It marked a fracture and a birth. The fracture, a formal split in the concept of empire. Now there were two emperors, two Romes, two visions of divine rule. The birth of what would become the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that would last in one form or another until the 19th century. Not Roman in geography, nor truly holy in practice, nor an empire in unity, but enduring, tangled in Europe's future. Charlemagne ruled for another 14 years after his coronation. His empire, though vast, was fragile. Upon his death in 814, it passed to his son, Louis the Pious, and then to his grandsons, who divided it in the Treaty of Verdun in 1843. This division would shape the future nations of Europe. France, Germany, Italy, all shadows of the empire Charlemagne had briefly revived. But the revival was never complete. The roads remained rough, the cities small, the legions never returned. Latin faded into French, German, Spanish. The Western world had changed too much to go back. And yet, in cathedrals and coronations, in law and learning, in coins and crowns, Rome lingered. Charlemagne had not restored the Roman Empire. He had transformed its memory into something new, a Christian empire, a feudal realm, a dream bound in iron and parchment. And so from the ashes of the old rose something unfamiliar, but not without beauty. In the next part of our story, the East will face its own turning point. A prophet will rise in Arabia, and a new civilization will burst forth from the deserts, changing not just the fate of Rome, but of the world. In the desert winds of the Arabian Peninsula, where caravans traced ancient paths across golden sands and nights were pierced by stars unmarred by smoke or stone, a voice began to speak. A voice that would reshape the known world. It was the early 7th century. The Eastern Roman Empire still stood, commanding the wealthy cities of Anatolia, the Levant and Egypt. Its emperor ruled from Constantinople. Its armies guarded the frontiers, and its churches thundered with debates about the nature of Christ. In the West, Charlemagne's empire had not yet risen. The Gothic kingdoms held sway in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, the Lombards in Italy. The Mediterranean world, once a Roman lake, was now fragmented, weary, divided. And then, in the city of Mecca, a merchant named Muhammad began to preach. This is the 13th part of our story, a transformation not from within the empire, but from its edge, one that would shatter old borders, reframe old truths, and challenge Rome not with swords at first, but with a revelation. Muhammad claimed he was the messenger of God, not a philosopher, not a mystic, not a poet, though his words moved with poetry, but a prophet, the final one. He called his message Islam, which means submission. He spoke of one God, merciful, just, all-seeing. He called people to prayer, to charity, to fasting, to humility, to brotherhood beyond tribe or blood. In 622 CE, he and his small group of followers fled persecution in Mecca and journeyed to the oasis town of Yathrib, later called Medina, the city of the Prophet. This journey, the Hijra, marked not an escape but a beginning. From that point on, the Muslim community, Ummah, was not merely spiritual. It was political, social, expanding. Within a decade, Muhammad had united much of Arabia, and shortly after his death in 632, the Arab tribes, once fragmented and feuding, surged outward, not as a mob, but as a mission. Caliphs, successors, led this expansion. They were not emperors in the Roman sense. They wore no diadems, held no golden thrones, but they carried the mantle of faith, and their armies moved with astonishing speed. The Byzantine Empire, weary from decades of war with Persia, was the first to feel the storm. In 636 CE, at the Battle of Yarmouk, Muslim forces clashed with the Eastern Roman army in what is now Jordan. It was a defining moment. The Byzantines were defeated decisively. Syria fell soon after. Then Palestine. Then Egypt. Great cities, Antioch, Damascus, Jerusalem, Alexandria, cities that had been Roman for centuries, now flew different banners. The loss was not just military, it was emotional. These lands were ancient seats of Christian faith, of Roman administration, of classical learning. Their fall cut deep into the heart of Byzantium, and yet the new rulers did not come to destroy. They taxed, but did not convert by force. Christians and Jews, people of the book, were permitted to keep their faiths, though under restrictions. Islamic rule was foreign, but not chaotic. In many cases, the change was more administrative than cultural. Local systems remained, scholars were welcomed, trade resumed, but the empire was changed forever. North Africa, too, was lost. Carthage, rebuilt again and again since its destruction by Scipio, finally fell for good. The waves that had once borne Roman galleys now carried Arab ships. The Mediterranean, once controlled from Rome and then Constantinople, was now contested. And further still, the Islamic world reached out across the Strait of Gibraltar into Iberia, eastward through Persia into Central Asia, south into the heart of Africa, north to the walls of Constantinople itself. Twice they laid siege to the city, in 674 and again in 717. The massive Theodosian walls held firm, and a secret weapon, Greek fire, a flammable liquid launched in bursts from bronze tubes, kept the sea from being crossed. Still, the psychological shift had occurred. Rome, even in its eastern guise, was no longer the unchallenged power of the world. A new civilization had emerged, rooted in revelation, guided by law, Sharia, drawn from the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet, united by Arabic, by prayer, by pilgrimage. Its capital moved from Medina to Damascus, then to Baghdad. From these centres, Islamic culture flourished. Astronomy, medicine, mathematics, philosophy. Greek texts were translated into Arabic, studied, debated, expanded. The works of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, saved and passed on. In a strange twist of fate, Rome's own intellectual heritage was being preserved by those who had taken its lands. The Christians of the East, Greek, Syriac, Coptic, continued to live under Muslim rule. Their churches still rang with liturgies, even as minarets rose beside them. It was a world not of peace, but of complexity, of friction and exchange, of cohabitation and conflict. And within the Byzantine Empire, faith hardened. The old pluralism, the debates between bishops, the arguments of councils, began to narrow. The loss of territory was seen by many as divine punishment. A new seriousness took root. Icons became battlegrounds. Images of Christ and the saints once venerated were now condemned by some as idolatry. This iconoclastic crisis would consume the empire from within, just as external threats pressed harder against its borders. And all the while the Islamic world continued to grow, not just in land but in vision. This was no longer a reactive force. It was a civilization, one that rivaled and surpassed Byzantium in many ways. And though it did not call itself Roman, it carried forward the sciences, the architecture, the civic order, the multilingual mosaic once nurtured in the empire's eastern provinces. A mirror and a rival. As centuries passed, the two would clash again and again, on battlefields, in theology, in trade, sometimes with steel, sometimes with silk, but always with the awareness that each stood for something vast, something rooted in destiny. Rome, it seemed, was no longer a singular flame. It had become a constellation. Its light refracted, divided, but never fully extinguished. In the cold halls of Constantinople, mosaics glittered like stars embedded in stone, casting reflections across the marbled floor as incense curled slowly into the dome of Hagia Sophia. The empire still stood, but its walls echoed with wariness. Rome, in its eastern form, had survived the storm, but not without bruises, not without cost. In this 14th part of our story, we turn inward once more to the Eastern Roman Empire, where emperors still ruled, but where survival had become an art of delicate balances between faith and heresy, tradition and transformation, war and diplomacy. The 8th and 9th centuries were an age of uncertainty in Byzantium. While the Islamic world grew in strength and Charlemagne's empire rose in the west, Constantinople wrestled with itself. The enemy outside had been fierce, but the enemy within was quieter, more insidious. It came in the form of questions about images, about faith. about the very nature of the divine. This was the time of iconoclasm. The crisis began under Emperor Leo III in the early 8th century. Shocked by military defeats, including the rapid loss of Syria and parts of Anatolia to Arab forces, Leo believed that divine wrath had descended upon the empire, not because of failure in strategy, but failure in spirit. He blamed the icons, the painted images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints so beloved in churches and homes, so venerated by monks and pilgrims, were declared a form of idolatry. In 726, Leo issued an edict forbidding their use. Icons were removed from churches. Some were destroyed, others hidden. This was not a theological nuance, it was a cultural upheaval. Monks resisted fiercely. They saw in the icons not idols, but windows to the divine. Their resistance turned into protest, and protest into martyrdom. Across the empire, a silent war flared between iconoclasts, those who supported the emperor's decree, and iconodules, those who defended the images. Families were divided, churches stripped bare, art burned. Emperors rose and fell depending on their stance. At times, whole cities turned against their bishops. This controversy lasted more than a century, through several reigns, councils and reversals. It was not resolved until 843, when Empress Theodora, ruling as regent for her young son Michael III, restored the veneration of icons. This event, remembered as the triumph of orthodoxy, marked the end of official iconoclasm. But the scars remained. The empire had survived the external threat, but its cultural soul had nearly torn itself apart, and in the background, Constantinople's influence had been shifting. Though it remained the capital of empire, it was no longer the undisputed centre of the Christian world. A new tension was rising, this time not with invaders, but with its western brother, Rome. Since the crowning of Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans, the papacy had drifted further from Constantinople. Language, theology, politics, all had created a growing divide. The East spoke Greek, prized ritual, and maintained imperial authority over the Church. The West, increasingly Latin and assertive, claimed its own primacy. Even the smallest difference, such as the insertion of the Filioque clause into the Nicene Creed by the Western Church, ignited fierce debate. Was the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son, or only the Father? To many, it seemed a minor point. But to the bishops of the East, it represented a dangerous innovation, a breach of sacred tradition. Rome had begun to see itself as the guardian of orthodoxy. So had Constantinople. But two guardians cannot share one gate. Despite the tension, Constantinople thrived. Its court remained rich, its scholars active, trade flowed through the Golden Horn, diplomacy danced with the caliphs, the Franks, the Bulgars and beyond, and a new force was growing on its northern frontier, raw and restless but curious, the Slavs. Among them, the Rus, a people of Scandinavian descent who had settled along the rivers of Eastern Europe, had begun to trade with Byzantium. Furs, wax, amber and slaves moved south, while silks, spices and silver moved north. In 860, they would appear not as merchants but raiders, sailing down the Dnieper, crossing the Black Sea and launching a sudden attack on Constantinople itself. The city withstood the assault, but it was a reminder that the world was changing. New powers were rising, and yet from this hostility came something unexpected. Missionaries from Constantinople, Saints Cyril and Methodius, travelled north, preaching to the Slavs, translating scriptures and creating the Glagolitic alphabet, the precursor to Cyrillic. Christianity in its Byzantine form began to take root among the Slavic peoples. It was not just trade that spread, it was faith, architecture, writing, law. In 988, the Grand Prince of Kiev, Vladimir I, would formally adopt Christianity for his people, choosing the Byzantine rite over the Latin after reportedly being awed by the beauty of worship in Hagia Sophia. Byzantium, it seemed, was not merely surviving, it was transforming, expanding in influence even as its borders shifted. But it could not escape its fate. Its strength was real but brittle, its theology profound but dividing, its politics elegant but often poisonous. The emperor remained a figure of majesty, but the throne was ever more vulnerable to intrigue. In time, these pressures, internal and external, would converge. And when they did, the great schism between East and West would come, not in battle but in declaration, not from fire but from words that could not be unsaid. The unity of the Christian world, one of Rome's last enduring legacies, would be shattered. and the pieces would fall, not evenly, but along the cracks time had already carved. In the sacred shadows of Hagia Sophia, where candles flickered beneath golden icons and choirs sang in ancient tongues, unity once held the Christian world together like a delicate thread of light, east and west, bound by creed, if not by empire. But the thread had frayed, and in the year 1054, it would finally snap. In this 15th part of our journey, we witness not a war of swords, but of beliefs, a schism not sudden but slow, formed over centuries of drifting until distance became division. The Church had always carried within it two great pillars, Rome and Constantinople. In the West, the Pope sat in the city of Peter, claiming apostolic authority as the successor to the first Bishop of Rome. In the East, the Patriarch of Constantinople held honour as leader of the imperial capital and spiritual guide to the Greek-speaking world. Both claimed primacy, one by inheritance, the other by position. But beneath the surface, deeper differences had grown. The West worshipped in Latin, the East in Greek. The West emphasised juridical clarity, centralised authority and original sin. The East treasured mysticism, conciliar governance and theosis, the process of becoming like God. Even the bread of communion was different, unleavened in Rome, leavened in Constantinople. A detail, perhaps. But in matters of faith, even details can become mountains. Still, for centuries they had found a way to walk together. With difficulty, with arguments, but with shared purpose, until power and pride intervened. In the early 11th century, Pope Leo IX reigned in Rome, a reformer, stern and convinced of papal supremacy. In Constantinople, Michael Cerularius served as patriarch, strong-willed, fierce protective of the traditions of the Eastern Church. Trouble began when Latin practices were condemned in Constantinople. Western churches were ordered closed. The papacy responded, sending a delegation to negotiate, but the air was already poisoned. Pride and mistrust hung over every word exchanged. In July of 1054, in the cool hush of Hagia Sophia, the papal legates placed a document upon the altar, a bull of excommunication declaring the patriarch and his followers outside the communion of Rome. Cerularius in return excommunicated them, and with that the church was broken, east and west, Catholic and Orthodox. It was not a loud rupture. There were no screams, no burning cities, only silence, a wound covered by formality, but its impact was profound. For the first time since the days of Constantine, the Christian world stood divided, not just by empire, but by soul. The schism was political, theological, cultural, and above all, personal. The people of Constantinople did not suddenly feel estranged from God, nor did the faithful in Rome feel abandoned. The average believer continued to pray, to fast, to sing, but the shepherds had parted ways. This fracture weakened both sides. For the Byzantines, it meant isolation. As threats grew from the east from the Seljuk Turks who had begun pressing into Anatolia, the empire found itself without Western allies. The Latins, now viewed with suspicion, were distant cousins rather than brothers. For the Latin West, the loss of communion with the East diminished the universal claim of the Pope and contributed to an increasingly insular theology, one that in time would give birth to further fractures still. But even as the split deepened, new forces stirred. In 1071, the Battle of Manzikert would devastate the Eastern Roman army. The Seljuk Turks under Alp Arslan crushed Byzantine forces and captured Emperor Romanus IV. It was more than a military loss. It was a shattering of confidence. Anatolia, the heartland of Byzantium, began to slip away. Desperate, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos turned to the west for aid. He sent envoys to Pope Urban II, requesting mercenaries to help defend the empire against the encroaching Turks. The response he received was more than he bargained for. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban called for a holy war, not merely to aid Byzantium, but to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. He spoke of Jerusalem, of Christendom under threat, of sins forgiven for those who took up the cross. The First Crusade was born. Tens of thousands, knights, peasants, pilgrims, took the cross and marched east. A tidal wave of devotion, greed, violence and longing. Some came for God, others for land, most for both. When they arrived in Constantinople, the Byzantines were stunned. These were not the disciplined troops they had hoped for. They were unruly, foreign in tongue and custom, and fiercely loyal to the Pope. Their arrival deepened the mistrust between East and West. Still, With Byzantine guidance, they crossed into Anatolia and began their long march toward Jerusalem. By 1099, they had taken the city. The blood of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants stained the streets. A Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was established. Crusader states formed. The West had returned to the East, but not as allies of Byzantium. As occupiers, the dream of reunion, brief and flickering, faded once more. Byzantium had hoped for protection. What it received was humiliation. The schism widened, and yet, in the middle of it all, the empire endured. Shrinking, reshaping, but not yet broken. Its scholars still studied. Its artists still crafted icons that gleamed with gold. Its hymns still rose like incense, echoing through candlelit halls. Constantinople remained, imperial, wounded, proud, but its enemies were closer than ever. The Latins no longer looked upon it as their elder, and the Turks, now entrenched in Anatolia, dreamed not just of conquest, but of the city itself. And one day, not so far in the future, those dreams would turn real. Not in whispers, but in thunder. Not through theology, but siege. Rome's last bastion was being watched, and time, relentless as always, was beginning to draw the curtain again. In the deepening dusk of the 12th century, Constantinople stood like a mirage of the past. Its towers gilded, its walls proud, its libraries still thick with the memory of Plato and Paul. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. Hairline fissures in stone and spirit. The empire was aging, shrinking, surviving rather than thriving, and beyond its gates, the world no longer waited with reverence. It circled. This 16th part of our story traces not a barbarian conquest nor an Islamic siege, but something far more bitter, a betrayal from within the Christian world. A turning point drenched not in prophecy or war against heathens, but in the dissonance of shared faith broken by greed, arrogance and vengeance. The year was 1204. The Fourth Crusade had been called, as the others before it, with the stated purpose of reclaiming Jerusalem. Pope Innocent III, fierce and visionary, had taken up the mantle of holy war with new urgency. Yet the political winds of Europe had changed. Kings were cautious, nobles distracted. The crusade did not attract the great royal houses as before. Instead, a strange and unstable coalition of lesser lords and ambitious knights formed the backbone of this new campaign. And they had a problem. They lacked ships. Enter Venice. The Maritime Republic, sleek and calculating, offered to provide a fleet to carry the Crusaders across the sea at a price. But when the time came, the Crusaders could not pay in full. The Venetians, always pragmatic, proposed an alternative: assist them in capturing the Christian city of Zara on the Adriatic coast, recently defected from Venetian control. It was sacrilege, attacking a fellow Christian city on a holy mission. But desperation made easy allies. The Crusaders agreed. Zara was sacked, and excommunication followed. Still, they pushed on. And then an unexpected twist: a Byzantine prince in exile appeared. Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II, promised the Crusaders everything: money, men, reunion with the Catholic Church, if they would help restore him to the throne in Constantinople. They agreed. In 1203, the Crusaders and Venetians arrived at the city's gates, not as enemies, but as armed negotiators. The walls loomed, the golden domes shimmered, and inside suspicion grew. Alexios was placed on the throne, but promises made in desperation were hard to keep. The treasury was depleted, the people resented the foreign presence, tensions rose. By 1204, patience had snapped. Riots broke out, the new emperor was overthrown. The Crusaders, now stranded, unpaid and insulted, decided to take the city for themselves. What followed was no mere battle. It was a calamity. On April 12th, 1204, Constantinople, imperial jewel, heir to Augustus, city of saints and emperors, was breached. The walls were scaled. The gates opened, and then for 3 days it was torn apart. The sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade was unlike any disaster the city had endured. The Crusaders looted palaces, desecrated churches, broke open tombs of emperors, and melted sacred relics for coin. Horses were led into Hagia Sophia, altars were smashed, icons shattered, gold ripped from mosaics centuries old. Latin chroniclers tried to justify it. Eastern chroniclers wept through their words. The city had stood for 9 centuries. Now it lay in ruins. What remained of the empire was carved like meat. A Latin empire was declared, with a Western noble placed on the throne. Byzantine aristocrats fled to the corners of the realm. Nicaea, Epirus, Trebizond, where they set up rival courts and plotted return. But something deeper had broken. The trust between East and West was shattered beyond repair. The schism of 1054 had been theological. This was physical, emotional, cultural, a wound that bled for generations. The Latins ruled Constantinople for 57 years. Their grip was weak. Their state was fragile. In 1261, Byzantine forces under Michael VIII Palaiologos retook the city. The empire was reborn, but barely. It returned to find itself gutted, its palaces empty, its treasury depleted, its population diminished, and while the banners of Byzantium once again flew above the city, the world around it had moved on. New powers now surrounded the fragile shell of the empire. In the Balkans, Serbian and Bulgarian kingdoms rose. In the east, the Seljuks had given way to something new, Turkish emirates, born from the Anatolian frontier, growing bold, swift, and devout. Among these was a small but ambitious beylik, ruled by a man named Osman. His house, his people, and the fire they would kindle would come to reshape the world and bring the final shadow across the last echo of Rome. But the Byzantines did not know this yet. For a brief time after 1261, they celebrated. The icons were restored. The choirs sang again in Hagia Sophia. The emperor was crowned, not in exile, but in the city of Constantine. And for a generation at least, it seemed that Rome's final air still breathed. But it was a breath taken in a house half consumed. Every victory from this point would be small, every loss devastating. The empire no longer dreamed of conquest, it dreamed only of survival. And outside its gates, the world waited, watching, growing, listening. The wind had shifted, and the walls of Constantinople, though proud, would soon feel the weight of a coming storm. By the dawn of the 14th century, the once glorious Byzantine Empire was little more than a collection of scattered stones, trying to remember the shape of a temple. Constantinople still stood, its walls intact, its domes luminous in the morning sun. But the empire beyond those walls had withered, provinces lost, fortresses crumbling. The purple-robed emperor ruled over shadows, more a memory than a monarch. In this 17th part of our journey, we walk quietly beside the twilight of Byzantium, a fading silhouette of Rome that still claimed eternity, even as the sands of time slipped faster through its trembling fingers. After retaking Constantinople in 1261, the Palaiologos dynasty attempted to restore what had been broken. Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos returned in triumph, but he found a city ransacked, depopulated, stripped of its riches. What had once been the beating heart of an empire was now a husk, gilded in name, hollow in strength. Michael turned his attention westward, hoping to keep the Latin powers at bay. He forged alliances, sought peace with the papacy, even promised to reunite the churches, a desperate bargain that was received with fury back home. The people of Constantinople had not forgotten the Latin sack. Any whisper of reunion with Rome was met with riots and curses. In the minds of many Byzantines, spiritual betrayal was more dangerous than military loss. Even as Michael fought to secure diplomacy, the foundations beneath him cracked. Anatolia, the breadbasket and backbone of the empire, was slipping away, not to empires but to emirs. The Turkish frontier had become a storm of shifting powers. After the collapse of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, small Turkish beyliks rose like embers from an extinguished fire. One such beylik, under the leadership of Osman, began expanding westward with silent determination. His people, later known as Ottomans, were organised, ambitious and devout. They offered stability, law and opportunity to the borderlands long neglected by Constantinople. Towns that had once flown the double-headed eagle banner now pledged allegiance to the crescent moon. Meanwhile, Byzantium fractured from within. The imperial court devolved into a theatre of intrigue and betrayal. Civil wars broke out with cruel regularity as emperors, co-emperors, cousins and generals fought not for the restoration of empire, but for its crumbs. Each internal conflict sapped what little strength remained. The civil war of 1321-1328 pitted Emperor Andronikos II against his grandson, Andronikos III. It dragged for years, devastated the countryside, and invited foreign interference. Andronikos III eventually emerged victorious, but at the cost of unity, territory, and trust. The empire had spent its blood fighting itself. When he died, the pattern repeated. John V Palaiologos took the throne as a child and another civil war ensued. The empire became a chessboard and the pieces were moved by Serbs, Bulgarians, Venetians and Turks. Everyone but the Byzantines themselves. The rulers of Constantinople had become vassals to fortune, dependent on outside mercy. The Ottomans watched closely. They had already seized much of northwestern Anatolia. Then they crossed the Dardanelles, quietly at first, raiding, testing. In 1354, an earthquake damaged the walls of Gallipoli. The Ottomans occupied the city, fortifying it before anyone could stop them. It became their first permanent foothold in Europe. There was no great battle, no proclamation, just the wind changing direction. And once in Europe, they did not stop. Cities fell, one by one, not through brute conquest, but by encirclement, deals, marriages, and the ever-present pressure of inevitability. They used their resources wisely, recruited from the lands they took, and trained a new class of soldier. The Janissaries, Christian boys taken as tribute, converted and raised to be elite warriors of the Sultan. Byzantium could do nothing. Its armies were a fraction of what they had once been, its economy in shambles. Even Constantinople, though protected by its mighty Theodosian walls, was now surrounded not by provinces, but by enemies. And still the emperors ruled. They held court, wrote decrees, celebrated feast days. Their power was ritual, their authority a thread. But even ritual can be holy, and the people, those who still remained, clung to the city as a sacred remnant. The city of Constantine, the city of God. Art and theology still blossomed within its gates. Icon painters composed scenes with reverence and sorrow. Monks copied old texts as if to preserve memory against the tide. Choirs sang hymns that echoed against nearly empty walls. It was not a dead city, but it was a ghost of a living one. Occasionally Western aid would arrive, a fleet from Venice, a contingent of knights from Genoa. Promises from Rome, always tied to reunion of the churches, always met with reluctance. The East had not forgotten 1204. Byzantium's final centuries were filled with small hopes and large despair. Every time the city looked outward for help, it was met with silence, terms, or betrayal. And every time it looked inward, it found fewer resources, fewer men, and fewer years left to wait. By the end of the 14th century, the Ottomans had surrounded Constantinople completely. Only the city itself and a few coastal outposts remained, and yet the flag still flew. The double-headed eagle still stretched its wings. But there was one truth left, unspoken yet undeniable. The empire was now only a city waiting for morning. And beyond its walls, a young Ottoman sultan, ambitious, brilliant and determined, was already dreaming of the day when Constantinople would no longer be the city of the Romans. But his story would come later. For now, the Byzantine Empire stood in the long pause before the final act, and the world held its breath. The moon rose over the Bosporus, casting a silver glow across the waters that once bore the fleets of emperors, merchants and missionaries. The towers of Constantinople stood like silent sentinels, unmoving, unchanged, while beyond the horizon, history moved swiftly. The empire behind those walls had shrunk to the size of its own shadow, but the city endured, not by strength, but by memory. In this 18th part of our story, we arrive at the final vigil of Byzantium, the years when the empire had become a myth still breathing, a name still worn, even as time pulled away from it like a tide retreating from a lonely shore. By the early 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was a ghost wrapped in marble. Manuel II Palaiologos ruled from a capital increasingly alone. Most of the Balkans were now Ottoman. The Anatolian heartland was long gone. Thessaloniki, once a proud city of learning and trade, had fallen to the Turks, briefly reclaimed, then lost again. The empire's revenues were meagre. Its population had dwindled. The army was a pale fragment of its former might. And yet, in its twilight, Constantinople refused to close its eyes. Manuel was no idle ruler. He travelled across Europe, unprecedented for a Byzantine emperor, seeking aid. To England, France, even the courts of the Holy Roman Empire he journeyed, bearing not just the dignity of his office, but the plea of a civilization. He spoke of the danger rising in the east, of the Ottomans encircling Christendom. He reminded the West that Constantinople had once protected all of Europe. But he returned with words, not armies. The West listened, but acted little. Their own conflicts, internal, dynastic and territorial, held their attention. The 100 Years' War raged between England and France. Papal rivalries, political divisions, and suspicions toward the Greek Church all conspired to keep the Byzantine pleas unanswered. Manuel spent his last years fortifying the city, writing theological treatises, debating with Muslim scholars, and preserving what little remained. He died in 1425, leaving the throne to his son, John VIII Palaiologos. John inherited not an empire, but a monument. And he, too, understood the danger. The Ottoman Sultan Murad II had continued his father's work, expanding, consolidating, preparing. The Ottomans were not just soldiers, they were architects of empire. Their administration was disciplined, their military tireless, their ambition clear. By now, the Byzantine emperor paid tribute to the sultans, annual payments that signalled what everyone already knew. Constantinople was no longer a capital, it was a client, a city-state clinging to its past. And yet, John still hoped. In 1439, he travelled to Ferrara and Florence to negotiate a union of the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. It was a desperate measure. In exchange for military aid, he agreed to the papal terms: recognition of papal supremacy, acceptance of the Latin Creed, and the controversial Filioque clause. The deal was signed, a union declared, but when John returned to Constantinople, he was met with fury. The clergy denounced the agreement, the people rejected it. To them, it was not salvation, it was betrayal. They had not forgotten the sack of 1204. Many said they would rather see the city taken by the Turks than kneel before a Latin pope. And so the hoped-for help from the West never arrived. Only one city would truly come, Genoa. Its merchants had long maintained quarters in Constantinople, and it sent a single man, a soldier of fortune and faith, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. He brought with him a few hundred men, experienced fighters, but not enough. In 1451, a new sultan took the Ottoman throne. His name was Mehmed, only 19 years old but brilliant, multilingual, learned and already experienced in war. He had one dream above all: to take Constantinople, to succeed where others had failed, to end the empire that claimed to be Rome. He began preparing in secret. Built a fortress, Rumeli Hisara, on the European side of the Bosporus, directly across from an older Ottoman tower. It controlled all passage. Mehmed was making it clear the siege would not be avoided. Then he commissioned a massive cannon, unlike anything seen before. Cast by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, the bombard was so large it took 60 oxen to move. It would be placed before the walls of Constantinople like a god of war, ready to speak in thunder. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine the Lest Palaiologos, brother of John VIII, now deceased, stood watch. He was a stoic man, devout, calm, unyielding. He knew what was coming, and he prepared as best he could. The city's defenders numbered perhaps 7,000. Most were civilians, a few thousand were foreign volunteers, a few hundred were professional soldiers, and all would face an Ottoman army of nearly 100,000. But Constantine did not flee. He strengthened the walls, repaired towers, stocked what little food he could. And when asked to surrender, he answered with dignity, "To surrender the city is not mine to give. It belongs to God, to the emperor, to the people." In April of 1453, the siege began. The Ottoman army surrounded the city by land and sea. Camps filled the fields beyond the walls. Warships filled the Golden Horn until the defenders blocked it with chains. So Mehmed hauled ships over land, greased logs turning forest into water, and bypassed the blockade entirely. The bombard fired, shaking stone, soil and sky. Day after day, week after week, but the walls, built in the days of Theodosius, held longer than anyone thought possible. The defenders repelled assault after assault. Night after night, they repaired breaches, sang hymns, and rang the bells of every church. Inside, the people fasted, prayed, waited, and outside, the Sultan waited too. Mehmed knew that every day made his conquest harder. The longer the city held, the more the West might rally, supplies could be smuggled in, morale could rise. So he made a decision, a final assault. He would launch everything, his army, his artillery, his janissaries, in a single coordinated strike. It would come at night, and with it, the end of Rome. On the night of May 28, 1453, a strange and sacred quiet fell upon Constantinople. For 53 days, the city had thundered beneath the weight of siege. Cannon blasts, cries of battle, the crack and crumble of ancient stone, but now it was still. Church bells rang softly. Candles flickered in windows. Streets that had once bustled with trade, with scholars, with children, were now filled with processions of prayer. From the mighty dome of Hagia Sophia to the smallest shrine hidden in the hills of the seventh hill, chants rose through the air, slow, solemn, and final. Emperor Constantine V Palaiologos walked through the city on foot, not as a ruler above his people, but as one among them. He moved through the churches, stopping at altars, kissing relics, offering silent blessings. Some said they saw him weep, not out of fear, but out of farewell. At the great church, clergy and soldiers stood side by side, Greeks, Italians, Genoese, Armenians. Some who had once quarrelled now held hands. Those who had refused the union with Rome now stood beside Latins in communion. In that moment, dogma dissolved into prayer. They took the Eucharist together beneath mosaics dimmed by dust and age. It was the last liturgy of the Roman world. Beyond the walls in the Ottoman camps Mehmed II had prepared, his forces had been reorganised into waves. Irregular infantry first, meant to exhaust and weaken the defenders, provincial troops and archers next, meant to storm the breaches, and finally the Janissaries, his elite soldiers, disciplined, trained from childhood, loyal only to him. Mehmed knew the city was tired, its walls were cracked, its men overworked, its supplies dwindling. But he also knew that cities like Constantinople did not fall easily, they fell all at once. And so, in the hours before dawn on May 29th, the assault began. The first wave surged forward, shouting, climbing, carrying ladders, testing the walls. They were driven back with arrows, stones, boiling oil. The defenders, though few, fought like men possessed. Even the women joined, tending the wounded, hauling stones, passing arrows. Then the second wave, better armed, more coordinated, pressed in. At the gate of St. Romanus, where the bombard had opened a deep fissure, the fiercest fighting took place. The breach was held, then lost, then held again. Blood coated the stones, but the defenders were tiring. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander and key figure in the city's defence, was struck by a cannon fragment. He was carried from the wall, some say against his will. His men, confused and demoralised, began to withdraw. Word spread quickly. The walls were failing. Constantine, upon hearing this, rushed to the breach. He cast aside imperial robes, took up his sword, and led a final charge. He fought among his men, shoulder to shoulder, refusing to abandon them. There was no ceremony, no last speech, only a soldier among soldiers, a Roman to the end. At some point in the chaos, he fell. His body was never definitively found. Later stories claimed he removed his purple garment so he might die unrecognised as a common man. Others said he was cut down with cries of, "The city is lost." The Janissaries surged through the breach. The walls, once impenetrable, were overrun. Soon after, another group breached the Kirkaporta gate, a small forgotten doorway accidentally left open. Once inside, the invaders poured into the city. Panic swept through the streets. Bells rang out wildly. Some citizens fled to their homes, locking doors and clutching icons. Others rushed toward the churches. Hagia Sophia filled with thousands, men, women, children, priests. They sang hymns as the doors were barricaded. The altar was prepared for what they believed would be a final miracle. Some said the angels would descend, that the Virgin would raise a shield over the city, that the walls would rebuild themselves, but miracles did not come. Ottoman soldiers broke through. The church was entered. The singing stopped. Icons were torn down. Gold was stripped from the altar. The city had fallen. Mehmed II entered the city hours later, riding through the broken gates. He ordered the looting cease. He made his way to Hagia Sophia. Dismounting from his horse, he walked slowly into the great cathedral, gazing upward at the massive dome. He picked up a handful of dirt from the floor and let it fall through his fingers. Then he gave the order. The church would become a mosque. He was 21 years old. He had taken the city that emperors, caliphs and crusaders had all failed to conquer. He had ended the empire that called itself Rome. The Byzantine Empire was no more, but the city was not destroyed. Mehmed understood its symbolism, its legacy. He declared Constantinople the new capital of his empire. He began repairs immediately, palaces, baths, mosques, markets. He welcomed back Christians and Jews. He invited Greeks, Armenians and Muslims to rebuild the city. He was no barbarian, no mere conqueror. He was a builder of empire. And he would take for himself a new title, Kaisari Rum, Caesar of the Romans. In his mind, and in the mind of many who followed him, the empire had not ended. It had passed, from Constantine to Mehmed, from cross to crescent, from Rome to Istanbul. The smoke had cleared, the bodies were buried, and the city, though wounded, stood. In this 20th part of our story, we do not follow legions or emperors, nor the crash of cannon against marble. We linger instead in the echo of that final fall, in the uneasy silence that comes after an ending, in the long, uncertain breath drawn by a world that had just watched the last vestige of Rome vanish into the hands of a new empire. 1453 did not only mark the death of Byzantium, it marked a shift so profound that the old world no longer recognised its reflection. The Byzantine Empire had died with dignity, but it had died nonetheless. And with it went a lineage that stretched unbroken for more than 1,000 years, from the founding of Constantinople in 330 by Constantine the Great, through the golden reigns of Justinian, Basil and Alexios, through centuries of siege and survival to the final breath of Constantine XI beneath the broken walls. And yet, as strange as it may seem, Rome's story did not simply stop. Because even as the city was taken, its language still lived, its rituals were not erased, its art and literature, its architecture, its law, its very imagination flowed like ink through the veins of the conquerors. Memphis had understood what he had captured. He was not just a military commander, he was a student of history, fluent in Greek and Latin, fascinated by Alexander, Julius Caesar and the Byzantine emperors. When he entered the imperial palace after the siege, he wandered its shattered corridors in silence. He paused before mosaics of Justinian and Constantine, whispered their names aloud. He did not gloat, he studied. Then he began to build. He ordered the reconstruction of Constantinople, not as a ruin of the past, but as the capital of a new future. He imported architects, masons, calligraphers and scholars. He rebuilt the aqueducts, restored the marketplaces, repopulated the city with Greeks, Jews, Medians, and Muslims. He invited fleeing Christians to return and established the Patriarchate anew under Ottoman protection. Constantinople was not razed, it was reborn, but no longer Roman. The Hagia Sophia, once the heart of Eastern Christendom, now rang with Arabic verses. Its golden icons were plastered over, its floors covered with rugs, its domes echoing with the call to prayer. Where once emperors wore purple and processed in solemn pageantry, now sultans sat beneath the tugra, signing decrees in ornate script, issuing orders from a palace that would rise not far from the ruins of the old one. Topkapi. This was the dawn of the Ottoman age. But while the Ottomans inherited the city, the memory of Rome flowed elsewhere too, westward. In Italy, where Renaissance thinkers began to dig through ancient texts with trembling fingers, the fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through minds already burning with rediscovery. Greek scholars fleeing the city brought with them manuscripts, lost dialogues of Plato, treatises of Aristotle, commentaries from ancient Alexandria. They carried not only knowledge, but flame, the flame of Rome's mind. In Florence, Venice, and Rome itself, these ideas took root. A rebirth began, not just of style and learning, but of identity. Rome was no longer a place. It was an ideal, a memory, a muse. Painters in Tuscany painted emperors draped in togas they had never seen. Sculptors carved new Caesars in marble. Poets dreamed of a republic. Philosophers debated virtue and law as Cicero had. Architects measured their buildings in ratios taught by Vitruvius. And popes, sensing the shift, began to speak more boldly. If the Eastern Empire had fallen, did that not leave one Rome standing? The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, claimed a new kind of inheritance, not as an emperor in robes, but as the spiritual heir to the Roman idea. The Vatican became a court, the Pope a prince among kings. And in time, the West would speak of two Romes fallen and a third that would never fall. That third wouldn't be in Italy. In the far north, in the snow-dusted halls of Moscow, a different claim was being formed. Ivan III, Grand Prince of Moscow, had married Zoe Palaiologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor. With her came the rites, the icons, the double-headed eagle. The belief that Moscow, not Rome or Constantinople, was now the final protector of true orthodoxy. The Third Rome, it would be called. So Rome had fallen, but it had not vanished. It had diffused into East and West, into Christian and Muslim, into church and court, into Renaissance workshops and Russian cathedrals, into law codes, art, memory and myth. The fall of Constantinople was not the end of an empire, it was the beginning of a world that could never again be one. And through it all, the old questions remained. What had Rome been? What had it meant? What had its people built? And why, after all its glory, had it collapsed? Those who asked did so with reverence, confusion, and longing. For even in ruin, Rome still whispered. As the centuries unfolded and the world reshaped itself along new borders, Rome's legacy continued to haunt the imaginations of kings, scholars, conquerors, and priests alike. It no longer ruled territory, no longer commanded legions or erected aqueducts, but it lived, etched into minds, inherited through law and memory, haunting the architecture of cathedrals, the cadence of ceremony, the dreams of empire. In this 21st part of our journey, we follow that haunting. We listen to the echo that lingered after the fall, and we ask, what exactly had ended, and what, if anything, had truly survived? The answer lay not in marble, but in myth. Rome had ceased to exist as a political entity. Its cities were occupied, its emperors were dead, its institutions dismantled or reborn under different names. But Rome had always been more than a government. It had become a story, one of permanence, of glory, of ordained dominion. And stories, unlike empires, do not fall when walls collapse. They drift. In the courts of Europe, Latin remained the language of learning, diplomacy, and law. Even as nations emerged, France, England, Castile, their rulers looked back to Rome as a wellspring of legitimacy. Their crowns, though gilded with new symbols, rested on a foundation drawn from Caesars and consuls. They quoted Roman texts, modelled their law codes on Roman precedent, traced their lineages through Roman-sounding myths. In the Holy Roman Empire, the fiction of continuity persisted longest. Though Voltaire would later mock it, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, it was for centuries a serious enterprise. Emperors were crowned in Aachen, in Frankfurt, and later in Vienna, always with the Roman past shadowing their titles. Charlemagne's coronation in 800 had set a precedent that to rule in God's name was to inherit Rome's mantle, but no one truly rebuilt it. The reality was different. The world had changed. Power was now fragmented. Feudal lords ruled patchworks of land. Cities began to assert independence. Banking and trade began to rival birth and blood. Rome as a central authority had died. What remained was its ghost, summoned when convenient, honoured in marble, but no longer alive. And yet, even in its ghostly state, Rome shaped the new. Renaissance humanists in Florence and Padua devoured old manuscripts. Cicero's letters, Lucretius's verses, Livy's histories, all were copied, discussed, debated. The ancients were no longer relics. They were reborn as guides, not just for art and architecture, but for how to think, how to govern, how to speak. The concept of the res publica, the public thing, stirred in the minds of republicans and rebels. Machiavelli, in his dark, clear prose, wrote not of medieval kings, but of Roman senators, generals, tyrants. He believed Rome's collapse offered lessons, bitter, honest ones, on how power works and how it crumbles. Rome had become a mirror, and then it became a warning. For those who studied it closely, the grandeur of Rome was never just triumph. It was also decay, luxury that dulled the blade of discipline, ambition that eroded into expansion that outpaced control, internal strife that made foreign invasion possible. Writers began to speak of decline, of fall, but what had fallen exactly? Some pointed to military exhaustion, others to moral decay. Some blamed the emperors, others the citizens, still others the church, or the barbarians, or fate itself. Each explanation said as much about the one offering it as it did about Rome. And still, the city itself remained. Rome, the physical city, once home to 1 million people, had become a village in the ruins. Goats grazed in the forum, aqueducts lay shattered. The Colosseum, no longer echoing with the roar of crowds, became a quarry, stripped for building stone. But pilgrims still came. Artists still sketched its arches. The Vatican grew in power as the papacy asserted spiritual inheritance from Peter rather than Caesar. In a strange irony, the successors to the emperors wore mitres instead of diadems. Meanwhile, in the East, the Ottomans embraced their conquest of Constantinople as the dawn of a new Roman order. They translated Roman legal concepts into Islamic governance. Mehmed and his heirs called themselves Kaisers of Rome, and in many ways their empire resembled what Byzantium had once been. Multi-ethnic, centralised, cosmopolitan, straddling continents and creeds. In Russia, The Tsars held to the belief that Moscow was the third Rome. The first had fallen to heresy, the second to the Turks. Only Moscow remained faithful and free. It too adopted the double-headed eagle. It too built cathedrals with domes that reached for heaven. Everywhere Rome had fallen, it had also been reborn, not in wholeness but in fragments, in laws, in languages, in dreams. The Latin alphabet spread across continents. Roman roads inspired modern infrastructure. Republics, empires and kingdoms all claimed Rome's name, even as they misunderstood it. Films, novels, architecture, political rhetoric. Again and again Rome returned, sometimes as glory, sometimes as ghost. And in that return, something profound remained. Rome had not simply ruled the ancient world, it had written itself into the world's imagination so completely, so deeply, that even in death, it could not be erased. It was not one empire among many, it was the idea of empire. And that idea, fractured, reinterpreted, refashioned, would continue to shape the centuries to come. In the quiet chambers of history, where civilizations are weighed not only by their achievements but by the questions they leave behind, the story of Rome lingers like the scent of smoke after fire. It drifts through time, elusive and unfinished, its end never fully accepted, its meaning never fully agreed upon. In this 22nd part of our journey, we listen to the voices that rose after Rome's fall. Philosophers, chroniclers, theologians and skeptics, all struggling to make sense of what had come to an end and what, if anything, had taken its place. The concept of the fall of Rome became, in many ways, an intellectual inheritance. It was no longer just a historical event. It became a moral fable, a political metaphor, a warning used and reused across the ages. To the early church fathers, Rome's collapse had been inevitable, a judgment upon paganism, a clearing of the stage for the true kingdom of God. Saint Augustine, writing in the wake of the sack of Rome in 410, had urged Christians not to mourn the fall of earthly cities. The city of man must perish, he said, for the city of God to rise. To him, Rome's temporal glory was always destined to be eclipsed by a spiritual one. But others saw something more tragic, more worldly. To the chroniclers of Byzantium, the fall of the Western Empire had not been a fall at all. It had been a misstep, a fracture, a moment that might still be repaired. They clung to the idea of continuity. Even in the 12th century, emperors in Constantinople issued decrees as Romans believed themselves heirs to Caesar and viewed the Latin West as rebellious children, not equals. Yet as centuries passed and the fires of Constantinople dimmed, a new clarity settled in. Rome had died, not once, but many times, and with each death, a resurrection. When Edward Gibbon began writing the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in the 18th century, he did so in an age of reason and revolution. He was sceptical of miracles, cool toward faith, and fascinated by cause and consequence. In his sweeping narrative, Gibbon laid out the decline not as divine punishment, but as human failure. He blamed internal decay, the loss of civic virtue, the rise of superstition, the spread of Christianity, which, in his eyes, had softened the Roman martial spirit and turned focus away from the tangible world. His was not the only interpretation, but it was influential. His Rome was not glorious and tragic, it was exhausted, slowly suffocated by complexity, bureaucracy, and the slow corrosion of what once made it great. Later historians challenged Gibbon's severity. They argued that what he saw as decay was adaptation, that the empire had not fallen so much as transformed. That Roman identity survived in countless forms, adapted by medieval kings, inherited by the church, echoed in Islamic governance, and quietly folded into modern institutions. Some even questioned whether decline was the right word at all. After all, what do we mean when we say that something has declined? If the architecture survives, if the laws endure, if the ideas remain, has the thing truly died, or has it simply changed shape? This is the paradox of Rome. Its fall was never clean, its lines were never sharp, its legacy defies finality. Empires before it had vanished, wiped from memory, names barely remembered, ruins reclaimed by jungle or sand. But Rome would not vanish. Its memory was cultivated, argued over, imitated. Its stories retold in 100 languages. Every age, every ideology found something to praise or condemn in its image. To revolutionaries, Rome was a republic, betrayed by tyranny. To monarchs, it was an empire of order and splendour. To Christians, it was both persecutor and protector, the crucifier and the converter. To modern democracies, it offered a model of law, a caution against corruption, a vocabulary of citizenship. To fascists, it was a symbol of authority, discipline and glory to be reclaimed, often grotesquely misunderstood, warped into something Rome itself would not have recognized. Even in popular culture, Rome endures. Films and novels reimagine its splendor. Gladiators and Caesars fill screens and pages. We dress modern stories in Roman armor, in togas, in wreaths of laurel. When we want to speak of empire, of ambition, of collapse, we speak of Rome. Because Rome was not just a place, it was an idea. And ideas, once born, do not die easily. They migrate, they evolve, they are rewritten. Perhaps that is the true heart of the Roman paradox, not that it fell, but that it never fully stopped falling. And never fully ceased to rise. It became a cycle, a mirror, a question. What is greatness? What sustains it? And what do we mourn when it is lost? These were not questions the Romans themselves could answer, not even at the height of their empire, but they are the questions we ask still when we walk beneath broken columns or sit in marble halls built centuries later, still echoing with Latin names and ancient ideals. Rome may be gone, but it taught the world how to remember. As dusk falls over the ruins of the Roman Forum and shadows climb the broken columns, a strange stillness fills the air, one that is neither mourning nor triumph, but memory. Stone holds memory like bone holds age, and Rome, even in ruin, speaks, not with the voices of generals or emperors, but with whispers shaped by time itself. In this 23rd part of our journey, we enter the quiet after the echo, where the legacy of Rome has become something both eternal and uncertain, woven into the very foundation of how we imagine civilization and how we fear its collapse. There is something deeply human in the way we return to Rome. We study it, not only for what it built, but for how it fell. Because behind that question, why did Rome fall, lurks another more personal one. Could what we have now fall the same way? The myth of Rome is not just a myth of grandeur, it is a myth of fragility. The image of aqueducts drying, of temples emptied, of legions withdrawing from distant frontiers, it all strikes a chord deep in the modern imagination. Not just historians, but poets, architects, politicians and filmmakers have all drawn from Rome's arc, from its impossible ascent to its unthinkable decline. We build cities and systems, and we wonder, in quiet moments, whether they too are destined to crumble. It is no accident that the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and even the American experiment looked to Rome as both a model and a warning. The founders of the United States spoke Latin, read Cicero, and adorned their institutions with neoclassical architecture. Their republic, like the Roman one, was born in rebellion against tyranny, but haunted by the knowledge that republics too can rot from within. Even in the 20th century, as fascist regimes in Italy and Germany invoked Rome to justify their twisted visions, it became clear that Rome's image was so powerful it could be reshaped to suit almost any ideology. Its ambiguity was part of its strength. To some, it was an empire of justice and roads, of law and language. To others, it was a machine of conquest, slavery and decadence. Both are true. Rome contained within itself the contradictions of empire. It was builder and destroyer, guardian and oppressor. It brought peace to many and annihilation to many more. It created a common world and erased countless others to do so. And perhaps that is why it compels us still, because in Rome we see our own duality. We look upon its fallen statues and broken amphitheatres and wonder not just what happened, but what does it mean that it happened? If Rome, with all its gods, its laws, its armies, its brilliance, if that could fall, then what is permanent? There is a loneliness to that thought, but also a kind of clarity. In the centuries following the fall of Constantinople, scholars in Europe turned more deeply toward the classical world. They did not seek to revive Rome as it was, but to learn from what it left behind. The Renaissance was born not just from admiration, but from salvage, from sifting through ruins and recovering fragments, from seeing beauty in incompleteness. And in that recovery, something changed. Rome became more than a history. It became a library. Its ideas were not prescriptions, they were questions. What is justice? How should power be shared? What does it mean to be a citizen? What makes a civilization endure? Rome never answered these questions for us. It offered examples, glorious, failed, ambitious, tragic, and left us to interpret them. That is perhaps its greatest gift, not certainty, but the courage to question. Even now, when we speak of Western civilization, when we use terms like Senate, forum, republic, dictator, tyranny, or virtue, we are speaking through the shadow of Latin, through the echo of Rome. When architects design government buildings in Washington or Paris, they often adorn them with columns that mimic the temples of the Capitol or the Parthenon. Not because those designs are practical, but because they symbolize endurance, legacy, authority. And yet, as the centuries pile up, we begin to realize the weight of Rome is not in what we copy, it's in what we forget. The Romans never believed their empire would fall. Even as crises multiplied, even as borders shrank, they thought themselves eternal. After all, hadn't they always survived? Hadn't they always adapted? Hadn't they always been Rome? We too are tempted by that illusion, to believe that systems, because they are familiar, will persist, to believe that decline is slow enough to see. That collapse gives warning, but Rome teaches us otherwise. Its collapse was slow, then sudden, then slow again. It happened in chapters, in silences, in reforms that came too late, in battles that were not supposed to be lost, in emperors who ruled cities instead of worlds. Its fall was not a moment. It was a mood, a fading of faith, a forgetting of purpose, a turning inward when danger was rising at the edges, not with fire, but with fatigue. And perhaps that is the most human lesson of all. Empires, like people, do not die only of wounds, they die of forgetting why they were alive. In the final part of our journey, we do not walk through ruins, nor sail past shattered harbours. We stand instead in the present, looking backward, not to mourn, but to understand. The dust has long settled, the last emperor is long buried. The stones of Rome have been reshaped into cathedrals, palaces and highways. Its eagles have fallen silent, but its breath remains. Rome has ended, and yet never entirely gone. Across the world, in libraries, capitals and classrooms, the questions still stir. In the hearts of historians and citizens alike, the shadow of Rome reaches forward. A shadow not cast in fear, but in fascination. How did it rise? How did it fall? What survives? And what does it all mean? In the 24th part of this tale, we turn toward reflection, not as a closing curtain, but as a soft candle still burning on the edge of history's long table. The fall of Rome is not one story, it is many stories braided together. Some sharp and sudden, like the sack of Rome in 410 or the final breach of Constantinople in 1453. Others are slow and imperceptible, decades of overextension, corrosion, compromise and forgetting. It did not collapse from a single wound. It unravelled like fabric, pulled thread by time until only memory remained. And that memory, paradoxically, became its greatest legacy. It is said that civilizations die twice, first when their power fades, and again when they are no longer remembered. Rome has refused to die that second death, because even as its empire vanished, its story became the foundation for others. Its mythos became the soil in which new nations rooted themselves. Its ruins became monuments, its language birthed others, its law inspired codes, its failures warned future founders, its brilliance provoked new dreams. It taught us that greatness is possible and that it is not permanent. That an empire can span continents and still fracture from within. That a republic can raise senators to the heavens and still fall to ambition. That innovation, culture, conquest and power are not enough if the soul of a people begins to forget what binds them. Rome is remembered not only for its victories, but for its contradictions. A republic that executed its champions. An empire that enslaved while preaching order. A civilization that preserved beauty while enacting brutality. It teaches us not to seek purity in history, but complexity. And so in the end, what truly caused the downfall of Rome? Was it the economy, the military, the weight of borders too wide to defend? Was it Christianity, as Gibbon claimed? Was it moral decline? Or external pressures too great? The truth is, it was all of it, and none of it. Rome fell because it changed, because the world around it changed, because the stories it told itself no longer matched the reality it faced, because its strength turned to habit and its victories turned to rituals, and its people grew tired of bearing the burden of eternity. No one wakes one morning and decides their civilization is ending. It happens slowly, then all at once, and then a new world begins. Not better, not worse, only different. That is Rome's final lesson, and perhaps its most important. Civilizations are not eternal. But meaning can be. We are not the heirs of marble and banners, we are the heirs of questions. What does it mean to be a citizen? What do we owe to one another? What happens when power forgets responsibility? What do we hold sacred, and who do we trust to protect it? Rome does not give us answers, it gives us the weight of its silence and the sound of its fall. It gives us the mosaic, broken and beautiful, of a world that once believed it could last forever. And from that mosaic we are left to build anew, with memory, with caution, with hope.